Chapter 12 of the Opal Serpent by Fergus Hume. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The New Life. For obvious reasons, Beecot did not return to Gwynne Street. It was difficult to swallow this bitter pill which Providence had administered. In place of an assured future with Sylvia, he found himself confronted with his former poverty, and with no chance of marrying the girl, and with the obligation of telling her that she had no right to any name. Paul was by no means a coward, and his first impulse was to go at once and inform Sylvia of her reverse of fortune. But it was already late, and he thought it would be only kind to withhold the bad news to the morrow, and thus avoid giving the disinherited girl a tearful and wakeful night. Therefore, after walking the embankment until late, Paul went to his garret. To the young man's credit, it must be said that he cared very little for the loss of the money, although he grieved on Sylvia's account. Had he been able to earn a small income, he would have married the girl and given her the protection of his name without the smallest hesitation. But he was yet unknown to fame. He was at variance with his father, and he could scarcely bring Sylvia to share his bitter poverty, which might grow still more bitter in that cold and cheerless garret. Then there was another thing to consider. Paul had written to his father explaining the circumstances of his engagement to Sylvia, and asking for the paternal blessing. To gain this, he mentioned that his promised wife had 5,000 a year. Bully and tyrant as Beecot Sr. was, he loved money, and although well off, was always on the alert to have more brought into the family. With the bribe of a wealthy wife, Paul had little doubt but what the breach would be healed, and Sylvia welcomed as the sweetest and most desirable daughter-in-law in the world. Then Paul fancied the girl would be able to subdue with her gentle ways the stubborn heart of his father, and would also be able to make Mrs. Beecot happy. Indeed, he had received a letter from his mother congratulating him on his wealthy match, for the good lady wished to see Paul independent of the domestic tyrant. Also Mrs. Beecot had made many inquiries about Sylvia's goodness and beauty, and hoped that he had chosen wisely, and hinted that no girl living was worthy of her son after the fashion of mothers. Paul had replied to this letter, setting forth his own unworthiness and Sylvia's perfections, and Mrs. Beecot had accepted the good news with joy. But the letter written to Beecot Sr. was yet unanswered, and Paul began to think that not even the chance of having a rich daughter-in-law would prevail against the obstinacy of the old gentleman. But when he reached his garret, after that lonely and tormenting walk on the embankment, he found a letter from his father, and opened it with some trepidation. It proved to contain joyful news. Mr. Beecot thanked heaven that Paul was not such a fool as he had been of yore, and hinted that this sudden access of sense, which had led him to engage himself to a wealthy girl, had come from his father and not from his mother. He, Beecot Sr., was aware that Paul had acted badly, and had not remembered what was due to the best of fathers. But since he was prepared to settle down with a rich wife, Beecot Sr. nobly forgave the past and Paul's many delinquencies, mentioned in detail, and would be glad to welcome his daughter-in-law. Then Beecot, becoming the tyrant again, insisted that the marriage should take place in Wargrove, and that the fact of Sylvia's father being murdered should be suppressed. In fact, the old gentleman left nothing to the young couple, but arranged everything in his own selfish way, even to choosing in Wargrove the house they would inhabit. The house, he mentioned, was one of his own, which could not be let on account of some trivial tale of a ghost, and Mr. Beecot would give this as a marriage gift to Paul, thus getting rid of an unprofitable property, and playing the part of a generous father at one and the same time. In spite of his bucolic ways, and pig-headed obstinacy, and narrow views, Beecot Sr. possessed a certain amount of cunning, which Paul read in every line of the selfish letter before him. However, the main point was that the old gentleman seemed ready to overlook the past and to receive Sylvia. Paul wanted to return to his home, not so much on account of his father, as because he wished to smooth the remaining years of his mother. And he knew well that Sylvia, with her gentle ways and heart of gold, would make Mrs. Beecot happy. So long as Paul loved the girl he wished to marry, the mother was happy. But Beecot Sr. had an eye to the money, and thus was ready to be bribed into forgiveness and decent behavior. Now all this was altered. From the tone of the letter, Paul knew that his father would never consent to his marrying a girl, not only without a name, but lacking the fortune which alone rendered her desirable in his eyes. Still, the truth would have to be told, and if Beecot Sr. refused to approve of the marriage, the young couple would have to do without his sanction. The position, thought Paul, would only make him work the harder, so that within a reasonable time he might be able to provide a home for Sylvia. So the young man, facing the situation bravely, wrote to his father and explained how the fortune had passed from Sylvia, but declared with all the romance of youth that he intended to marry the girl all the same. If Beecot Sr., said Paul, would permit the marriage and allow the couple a small income until the husband could earn enough to keep the pot boiling, the writer would be grateful. If not, Paul declared firmly that he would work like a slave to make a home for his darling, but nothing in the world would make him give up Sylvia. This was the letter to his father, and then Paul wrote one to his mother, detailing the circumstances and imploring her to stand by him, although in his own sinking heart he felt that Mrs. Beecot was but a frail reed on which to lean. He finished these letters and posted them before midnight. Then he went to bed and dreamed that the bad news was all moonshine, and that Sylvia and he were a happy, rich married pair. But the cold gray searching light of dawn brought the actual state of things again to his mind, and so worried him that he could hardly eat any breakfast. He spent the morning in writing a short tale for which he had been promised a couple of sovereigns, and took it to the office of the weekly paper which had accepted it, on his way to Gwynn Street. Paul's heart was heavy, thinking of what he had to tell, but he did not intend to let Sylvia see that he was despondent. On turning down the street he raised his head, assumed a smile, and walked with a confident step into the shop. As he entered, he heard a heavy woman plunge down the stairs and found his arm grasped by Deborah, very red-faced and very furious, the moment he crossed the threshold. Bart could be heard knocking boxes together in the cellar, as he was getting Deborah's belongings ready for removal to Jubilee Town, where the cottage and the drying ground for the laundry had already been secured through Posh. But Paul had no time to ask what was going on. A glance at the handmaiden's tearful face revealed that she knew the worst, in which case Sylvia must also have heard the news. "Yes," cried Deborah, seeing the sudden whiteness of Paul's cheeks and shaking him so much as to hurt his injured arm. "She knows. She do. Oh, Lord bless us, that things should come to this. And there she's setting a crying out her beautiful eyes for you, Mr. Beecot, thinking of you throwing her over. And if you do," shouted Deborah, with another shake, "you'd had better been smashed to jelly than face me in my present state. Seeing you from the window, I made bold to come down and ask your intendings. For if them do mean no marriage, and the breaking of my pretty's heart, never shall she set eyes again on a double-faced Jonah, and—" Here Deborah gasped for breath and again shook Paul. "Deborah," he said, in a quiet voice, releasing himself, "I love Sylvia for herself and not for her money." Deborah threw her brawny arms in the air and her apron over her red head. "I knowed it. Oh, yes, indeed," she sobbed in muffled tones. "Says I says, Mr. Paul's a gentleman, whatever his frantic pa may be, and marry you, my own lovely, he will, though not able to afford the marriage fees, the same as will come out of Debby's pocket, though the laundry go by the board. Heaven knows what we'll live on all the same. Poor workhouse idiots as me and Bart are, not being able to make you and Miss Sylvia happy. Miss Sylvia Krill and Norman both," ended Deborah with emphasis, "whatever that smooth cat with the grin and the claws may say. Drat her for a slimy tabby. Yeah." "I see you know all," said Paul, as soon as he could slip in a word. "Know all!" almost yelled Deborah, dragging down the apron and revealing flashing eyes. "And it's a mystery I ain't in Old Bailey this very day for scratching that monkey of a Pash. Oh, if I'd known what he was, never should he've got me the laundry, though the same may have to go, worse luck. Oh, yus, he come, and she come with her kitten as is almost as big a cat as she is. Mrs. Krill, bless her. Oh, yes, Mrs. Krill, the sneaking, smiling Jezebel." "Did she see Sylvia?" asked Beecot sharply. "Yes, she did," admitted Deborah, "me letting her in, not knowing her scratchings. And the monkey and the kitten come too, a spying out the land, as you may say. When I heard the news, I howled, Mr. Paul, but my pretty, she turned white, like one of them plaster statues as boys sell cheap in the streets. And says she says, oh, Paul, if you'll forgive me mentioning your name, sir, without perliteness." "Bless her, my darling, did she think of me?" said Beecot tenderly. "Ah, when do she not think of you, sir? 'Eart of gold, though none in her pocket by means of that Old Bailey woman as is a good match for my Old Bailey master. Oh, he was a bad one, and how Miss Sylvia ever come to have such a pa beats me. But I thank heaven the cat ain't my pretty's ma, though she do have a daughter of her own, the painted, stuck up parcel of bad bargains." Paul nodded. "Calling names won't do any good, Deborah," he said sadly. "We must do the best we can." "There ain't no chance of the law getting that woman to the gallows, I suppose. The woman is your late master's lawful wife. Pash seems to think so, and has gone over to the enemy." Here Deborah clenched her mighty fist and gasped. "Sylvia's mother was married later, and as the former wife is alive, Sylvia is—" "No," shouted Deborah, flinging out her hand, "don't say it." "Sylvia is poor," ended Paul calmly. "What did you think I was about to say, Deborah?" "What that cat said, insulting my pretty. But I shoved her out of the door, telling her what she were. She gave me and Bart and my own sunbeam notice to quit," gasped Deborah, almost weeping, "and quit we will this very day. Bart's been a packing at this morning. Hear him knocking, and I wish he was knocking at Mrs. Krill's head. That I do, the flaunting hussy as she is, drat her." "I'll go up and see Sylvia. No, Deborah, don't you come for a few minutes. When you do come, we'll arrange what is to be done." Deborah nodded acquiescence. "Take my lovely flower in your arms, sir," she said, following him to the foot of the stairs, "and tell her as your heart is true, which true I knowed it would be." Beecot was soon in the sitting room, and found Sylvia on the sofa, her face buried in her hands. She looked up when she recognized the beloved footsteps, and sprang to her feet. The next moment she was sobbing her heart out on Paul's faithful breast, and he was comforting her with all the endearing names he could think of. "My own, my sweet, my dearest darling," whispered Paul, smoothing the pretty brown hair. "Don't weep. You have lost much, but you have me." "Dear," she wept, "do you think it is true?" "I am afraid it is, Sylvia. However, I know a young lawyer who is a friend of mine, and I'll speak to him." "But, Paul, though my mother may not have been married to my father—" "She was, Sylvia, but Mrs. Krill was married to him earlier. Your father committed bigamy, and you, poor child, have to pay the penalty." "Well, even if the marriage is wrong, the money was left to us." "To you, dear," said Beecot, leading her to the sofa. "That is, the money was left in that loosely worded will to my daughter. We all thought it was you, but now this legal wife has come on the scene. The money must go to her daughter." "Oh, Sylvia," cried Paul, straining her to his breast, How foolish your father was not to say the money was left to my daughter Sylvia. Then everything would have been right. But the absence of the name is fatal. The law will assume that the testator meant his true daughter." "Am I not his true daughter?" she asked, her lips quivering. "You are my own darling, Sylvia," murmured Paul, kissing her hair. "Don't let us talk of the matter. I'll speak to my lawyer friend, but I fear from the attitude of Pash that Mrs. Krill will make good her claim. Were there a chance of keeping you in possession of the money, Pash would never have left you so easily." "I am so sorry about the money on your account, Paul." "My own," he said cheerily, "money is a good thing, and I wish we could have kept the 5,000 a year. But I have you, and you have me, and although we cannot marry for a long time, yet—" "Not marry, Paul? Oh, why not?" "Dearest, I am poor. I cannot drag you down to poverty." Sylvia looked at him wide-eyed. "I am poor already." She looked round the room. "Nothing here is mine. I have only a few clothes. Mr. Pash said that Mrs. Krill would take everything. Let me marry you, darling," she whispered coaxingly, "and we can live in your garret. I will cook and mend, and be your own little wife." Beecot groaned. "Don't tempt me, Sylvia," he said, putting her away. "I dare not marry you. Why, I have hardly enough to pay the fees. No, dear, you must go with Debby to her laundry, and I'll work night and day to make enough for us to live on. Then we'll marry and—" "But your father, Paul?" "He won't do anything. He consented to our engagement, but solely, I believe, because he thought you were rich. Now, when he knows you are poor, and I wrote to tell him last night, he will forbid the match." "Paul!" She clung to him in sick terror. "My sweetest," he caught her in his arms. "Do you think a dozen fathers would make me give you up? No, my love of loves, my soul, my heart of hearts. Come good, come ill, we will be together. You can stay with Debby at Jubileetown until I make enough to welcome you to a home, however humble. Dear, be hopeful, and trust in the God who brought us together. He is watching over us, and knowing that, why need we fear? Don't cry, darling heart." "I'm not crying for crying," sobbed Sylvia, hiding her face on his breast and speaking incoherently. "But I'm so happy." "In spite of the bad news?" asked Paul, laughing gently. "Yes, yes. To think that you should still want to marry me. I am poor. I have no name, and—" "Dearest, you will soon have my name." "But Mrs. Krill said—" "I don't want to hear what she said," cried Paul, impetuously. "She's a bad woman. I can see badness written all over her smiling face. We won't think of her. When you leave here you won't see her again. My own dear little sweetheart," whispered Paul, tenderly, "when you leave this unhappy house, let the bad past go. You and I will begin a new life. Come, don't cry, my pet. Here's Debby." Sylvia looked up and threw herself into the faithful servant's arms. "Oh, Debby, he loves me still. He's going to marry me whenever he can." Deborah laughed and wiped Sylvia's tears away with her coarse apron tenderly. "You silly flower," she cried caressingly. "You foolish queen of honey bees. Of course he have you in his heart. You be bride and I'll be bridesmaid, though not a pretty one, and all will be honey and sunshine and gates of pearl, my beauty." "Debby, I'm so happy." Deborah placed her young mistress in Paul's arms. "Then let him make you happier, pretty lily of the valley. Lord, as if anything bad would ever come to you two, while silly old Debby have a leg to stand on and arms to wash. Though the laundry, oh, Lord!" And she rubbed her nose till it grew scarlet. "What of it, Mr. Beecot, I do ask? Have you enough money to pay a year's rent?" "Yes, me and Bart have saved 100 between us. Rent and furniture and taxes can come out of it, sure. And my washin's what I call washin'," said Deborah, emphatically. "No lost buttons and torn sheets and ragged collars. I'll wash agin the Queen herself, though I says as it shouldn't. Give me a tub, and you'll see if the money don't come in." Well then, Deborah, as I am too poor to marry Sylvia now, I want her to stop with you till I can make a home for her." "And where else should she stop but with her own silly, foolish Debby, I'd like to know? My flower, you come and be queen of the laundry." "I'll keep the accounts, Debby," said Sylvia, now all smiling. "You'll keep nothing but your color and your dear heart up," retorted Debby, sniffing. "Me and Bart will do all. And this blessed day we'll go to Jubileetown with our belongings. And you, Mr. Beecot, I'll come and see you settled, Deborah, and then I return to earn an income for Sylvia. I won't let you keep her long." "She'll stop as long as she have the will," shouted Debby, hugging Sylvia. "As to that Krill cat, she could take possession as soon as she likes. And, Deborah," added Paul significantly, "for all that has happened, I don't intend to drop the search for your late master's murderer." "It's that Krill cat has done it," said Debby, "though I ain't got no reason for saying of such a thing." Chapter 13 of the Opal Serpent by Fergus Hume. This recording is in the public domain. The detective's views. As Paul expected, the next letter from his father contained a revocation of all that had pleased him in the former one. Beecot Sr. wrote many pages of abuse. He always did babble like a complaining woman when angered. He declined to sanction the marriage, and ordered his son at once, underlined, to give up all thought of making Sylvia Norman his wife. It would have been hard enough, wrote Beecot, to have received her as a daughter-in-law, even with money, seeing that she had no position and was the daughter of a murdered tradesman. But seeing also that she was a pauper, and worse, a girl without a cognomen, he forbade Paul to bestow on her the worthy name of Beecot, so nobly worn by himself. There was much more to that same effect, which Paul did not read, and the letter ended grandiloquently in a command that Paul was to repair at once to the manor, and there grovel at the feet of his injured father. To this despotic epistle the young man answered in a few lines. He said that he intended to marry Sylvia, and that nothing would make him give her up, and that he would not meet his father again until the father remembered that his son was an Englishman and not a slave. Paul signed his letter without the usual "your affectionate son," for he felt that he had small love for this imperious old man who declined to control his passions. So he now knew the worst. The breach between himself and his father was wider than ever, and he had only his youth and his brains to depend upon, in making a living for himself and a home for Sylvia. Strange to say, Paul's spirits rose, and he braced himself bravely to do battle with fortune for his beloved. Sylvia, under the charge of Deborah, was escorted by Bart Tawsey, who duly left Gwynne Street, bag and baggage, and she was now established in Rose Cottage, Jubileetown. The house was a small one, and there was not a single rose in the garden around it. Indeed, as the cottage had been newly erected, there was not even a garden, and it stood amidst a bare acre with a large drying ground at the back. But the cottage on the outskirts of the new suburb was, to all intents and purposes, in the country, and Sylvia's weary eyes were so gladdened by green fields and glorious trees that she forgot the nakedness of her immediate surroundings. She was assigned the best room in this small abode, and one of the first things she did was to write a letter to Paul, asking him to repair to Rose Cottage to witness the marriage of Deborah and Bart. The handmaiden thought this was necessary, so that she could make full use of her intended husband. "If he wasn't here always," said the bride-elect, "he'd be gadding about idling. I know him. And me getting a business together won't be easy, unless I've got him at hand, as you may say, to take round the bills, let alone that he ought to sleep in the house in case burglars get in. and sleep in the house without the blessings of matrimony he can't, my pretty. So that's all about it." Deborah, as an American would say, was a hustler, and having made up her mind, she did not let grass grow under her feet. She called on the vicar of the parish and explained herself at great length, but suppressed the fact that she had formerly lived in Gwynne Street. She did not want the shadow of the murder to cast a gloom over her new home, and therefore said nothing about the matter. All the vicar, good easy soul, knew was that Deborah had been a servant in a respectable family, whereabouts not mentioned, that the father and mother had died, and that she brought the only daughter of the house to live with her and be treated like a lady. Then Deborah demanded that the banns should be put up, and arranged that Bart should take up his abode in the parish for the necessary time. This was done, and for 3 Sundays Deborah had the pleasure of hearing the banns announced, which foretold that Bart Tawsey and herself would soon be man and wife. Then the marriage took place. The future Mrs. Tawsey had no relatives, but Bart produced a snuffy old grandmother from some London slum, who drank gin during the wedding feast, much to the scandal of the bride. Paul acted as best man to Bart, and Sylvia, in her plain black dress, was bridesmaid. Mrs. Purr, the grandmother, objected to the presence of black at a wedding, saying that was unlucky, and told of many fearful incidents which had afterwards occurred to those who tolerated such a funeral garb. But Deborah swept away all opposition. "What!" she shouted in her usual style, "not have my own sweet pretty to ask a blessing on my marriage, and she not able to get out of her blacks? I'm astonished at you, Mrs. Purr, and you an old woman as ought to know better. I doubt if you're Bart's granny. I've married into an idjit race. Don't talk to me, Miss Purr, if you please. Live clean and work hard, and there's no trouble with them husbands. And has to love, honor, and obey you." And she sniffed. "Them words you have to say," muttered Mrs. Purr. "Ho," said Deborah scornfully. "I'd like to see me say 'em to such a scrub as Bart." But say them she did at the altar, being compelled to do so by the vicar. But when the ceremony was over, the newly made Mrs. Tawsey took Bart by the arm and shook him. He was small and lean and of a nervous nature, so he quivered like a jelly in his wife's tremendous grip. Deborah was really ignorant of her own strength. "You hark to me, Bart," she said, while the best man and bridesmaid walked on ahead talking lovingly. "I said them words which you ought to have said, because you ain't got no memory to speak of. But they ain't my beliefs, but yours, or I'll know the reason why. Just you say them now. Swear without Billingsgate as you'll always love, honor, and obey your loving wife." Bart, still being shaken, gasped out the words, and then gave his arm to the lady who was to rule his life. Deborah kissed him in a loud, hearty way, and led him in triumph to the cottage. Here Mrs. Purr had prepared a simple meal, and the health of the happy pair was proposed by Paul. Mrs. Purr toasted them in gin, and wept as she did so. A dismal, tearful old woman was Mrs. Purr, and she was about to open her mouth in order to explain what she thought would come of the marriage, when Mrs. Tawsey stopped her. "None of them groans," cried Deborah with vigor. "I won't have my wedding made funerals. Hold your tongue, Mrs. Purr, and you, Bart, just swear to love, honor, and obey my pretty as you would your own lawful wife, and the ceremonies is off." Bart performed the request, and then Paul, laughing at the oddity of it all, took his leave. On walking to the gate, he was overtaken by Mrs. Purr, who winked mysteriously. "Whatever you do, sir," said the lean old creature, with many contortions of her withered face, "don't have nothing to do with Tray." "Tray?" echoed Paul in surprise. "Mr. Pash's office boy?" "Him and no other. I know his grandmother has been up for drunk 200 times, and is proud of it. Stretchers is as common to her, sir, as kissing is to a handsome young gent like you. And the boy takes after her. A deep young cuss," whispered Granny Purr significantly. "But why should I beware of him?" asked Beecot, puzzled. "A nod's a wink to a blind one," croaked Mrs. Purr, condensing the proverb and turning away. "Just leave that brat Tray to his own wickedness. They'll bring him to the gallows some day." "But I want to know." "Ah, well then, you won't, sir. I says what I says, and I says no more nor I ought to say. So good night, sir," and Mrs. Purr toddled up the newly gravelled path and entered the cottage, leaving an odour of gin behind her. Beecot had half a mind to follow, so strange was the hint she had given him. Apparently she knew something which connected him with Tray, and Paul wondered for the 50th time if the boy had picked up the opal brooch. However, he decided to leave the matter alone for the present. Mrs. Purr, whom Deborah had engaged to iron, was always available, and Paul decided that should anything point to Tray's being implicated in the finding of the Opal Serpent, that he would hand him over to Hurd, who would be better able to deal with such a keen young imp of the gutter. Thus making up his mind, Paul dismissed all thought of Mrs. Purr's mysterious utterance, and walked briskly to the nearest bus stand, where he took a blue vehicle to the Bloomsbury district. All the way to his garret he dreamed of Sylvia, and poor though was the home he left her in, he was thankful that she was there in the safe shelter of Mrs. Deborah Tawsey's arms. It was 5 o'clock when Paul arrived at the door of the stairs leading to his attic, and here he was touched on the shoulder by no less a person than Mr. Billy Hurd. Only when he spoke did Paul recognize him by his voice, for the gentleman who stood before him was not the brown individual he knew as the detective. Mr. Hurd was in evening dress, with the neatest of patent boots and the tightest of white gloves. He wore a brilliantly polished silk hat, and twirled a gold-headed cane. Also, he had donned a smart blue cloth overcoat with a velvet collar and cuffs. But though his voice was the voice of Hurd, his face was that of quite a different person. His hair was dark and wore rather long. His moustache, black and large, and brushed out a la Kaiser, and he affected an eyeglass as immovable as that of Hayes. Altogether a wonderfully changed individual. "Hurd," said Paul, starting with surprise. "It's my voice told you." But now he spoke a tone higher, in a shrill sort of way, and with a foreign accent. "Would you me discover, mon ami?" he inquired, with a genuine Parisian shrug. "No. Why are you masquerading as a Frenchman, Hurd?" "Not Hurd in this skin, Mr. Beecot. Comte de la Tour, à votre service," and he presented a thin glazed card with a coronet engraved on it. "Well, Count," said Beecot, laughing, "what can I do for you?" "Come up to your room," said the pseudo count, mounting the stairs. "There's something to be talked over between us." "Not bad news, I hope." "Ah, my poor friend," said the detective, in his usual genial voice, "you have had enough bad news, I am aware. To lose a lovely wife and a fine fortune at once. Ah, what a pity!" "I have lost the money certainly," said Beecot, lighting his lamp, "but the wife will be mine as soon as I can save sufficient to give her a better home than this." Monsieur le Comte de la Tour sat down and gracefully flung open his overcoat so as to expose a spotless shirt front. "What?" he asked, lifting his darkened eyebrows. "So you mean to marry that girl?" "Of course," said Paul, angrily. "Do you think I'm a brute?" "But the money?" "What does that matter? I love her, not the money." "And the name, her birth?" "I'll give her my own name, and then we'll see who will dare to say a word against my wife." Hurd stretched out his hand, and grasping that of Beecot's, shook it warmly. "Upon my word you are a man, and that's almost better than being a gentleman," he said, heartily. "I've heard everything from Mr. Pash, and I honor you, Mr. Beecot, I honor you." Paul stared. "You must have been brought up in a queer way, Hurd," he said, dryly. to express his surprise because a man acts as a man and not as a blackguard. "Ah, but you see in my profession I have mixed with blackguards, and that has lowered my moral tone. It is refreshing to meet a straight, honorable man such as you are, Mr. Beecot. I liked you when I first set eyes on you, and determined to help you discover the assassin of Aaron Norman." "Lemuel Krill, you mean?" "I prefer to call him by the name we both know best," said Hurd. "But as I was saying, I promised to help you find out who killed the man, and now I'll help you get back the money." Paul sat down and stared. "What do you mean?" he asked. "The money can't be got back. I asked a legal friend of mine, and put the case to him, since that monkey of a Pash has thrown us over. My friend said that as no name was mentioned in the will, Maud Krill would undoubtedly inherit the money. Besides, I learn that the certificate of marriage is all right. Mrs. Krill undoubtedly married Aaron Norman under his rightful name 30 years ago." "Oh, yes, that's all right," said Hurd, producing a dainty silver cigarette case which was part of his get-up. "Mrs. Krill is the widow of the murdered man, and the silly way in which the will has been made gives the 5,000 a year to her daughter, who Mrs. Krill has under her thumb. It's all right, as I say, but I shouldn't be surprised to learn that there were circumstances in Aaron Norman's past life which led him to leave his wife, and which may lead Mrs. Krill into buying silence by giving Miss Norman half the income. You could live on 2,000 odd a year, eh?" "Not obtained in that way," said Beecot, filling his pipe and passing a match to Hurd. "If the money comes legally to Sylvia, well and good. Otherwise, she will have nothing to do with it." Hurd looked round the bleak garret expressively, and shrugged his shoulders again. "I think you are wrong, Mr. Beecot. You can't bring her here." "No, but I may make enough money to give her a better home." "Can I help you?" "I don't see how you can. I want to be an author." "Well," said Hurd, whose British speech was in strange contrast to his foreign appearance, "it's not a bad game to be an author if you get a good serial connection. Oh, don't look surprised. I know about newspapers and publishers as I know about most things. See here, Mr. Beecot, have you ever tried your hand at a detective story?" "No, I write on a higher level." "You won't write on a more paying level," replied Hurd, coolly. "I know a newspaper which will give you, if I recommend you, mind, £100 for a good detective yarn. You apply for it." "But I couldn't make up one of those plots, so intricate." "Pooh, it's a trick. You set your puppets in such and such a way, and then mix them up. I'll give you the benefit of my experience, and as a tech, with my plot and your own writing, we'll be able to knock up a story for the paper I talk of. Then, with £100, you'll have a nest egg to start with." "I accept with gratitude," said Beecot, moved, "but I really don't know why you should trouble about me." "Because you're a white man and an honorable gentleman," said the detective emphatically. "I've got a dear little wife of my own, and she's something like this poor Miss Norman. Then again, though you mightn't think so, I'm something of a Christian, and believe we should help others. I had a hard life, Mr. Beecot, before I became a detective, and many a time I have learned that prayers can be answered. But this is all beside the question," went on Hurd quickly, and with that nervous shame with which an Englishman masks the better part of himself. "I'll see about the story for you. Meanwhile, I'm going to a card party to meet incidentally Mr. Grexon Hay." "Ah, you still suspect him?" "I do, and with good reason. He's got another mug in tow. Lord George Sandal, the son of Lord, well, I needn't mention names, but Hay's trying to clear the young ass out, and I'm on the watch. Hay will never know me as the Count de la Tour. Not he. Smart as he is, I'm fly." "Do you speak French well?" "Moderately. But I play a silent part and say little. I shut my mouth and open my eyes. But what I came here to say is that I intend to find out the assassin of Aaron Norman." "I can't offer you a reward, Hurd," said Paul with a sigh. "Oh, that's all right. The widow, by advice of Pash, has doubled the reward. £1,000 it is now. Worth winning, eh?" Said Paul moodily. "I shouldn't think she loved her husband so much as that." Hurd's brown eyes shot a red flame which showed that he was excited, though he was cool enough externally. "Yes," he admitted in a careless manner, "she certainly does act the weeping widow in a rather exaggerated fashion. However, she's got the cash now, or at least her daughter has, which is the same thing. The two have taken up their quarters in a fashionable hotel in the West End, and are looking for a house. The old woman manages everything, and she will be one too many for Mr. Hay." "What? Does he know Mrs. Krill? He said he didn't." "Quite right. He didn't when the ladies went first to Pash's office. But Hay, on the lookout for a rich wife, got Pash to introduce him to the ladies, who are charmed with him. He's making up to the daughter, even in the few weeks that have elapsed, and now is assisting them to find a house. The daughter loves him, I fancy, but whether the mother will allow the marriage to take place, I can't say." "Surely not on such a short acquaintance." Hurd bent forward, as about to say something, then changed his mind. "Really, I don't know. Hay is fascinating and handsome. Have you been to see him yet?" "No, he asked me, but all these troubles have put him out of my head. Why do you ask?" "Because next time he invites you, go." "You warned me against him." "And I warn you again," said the detective dryly. "Don't ask me to explain, for I can't. But you go see Hay when he invites you, and make yourself agreeable, especially to Mrs. Krill." "Am I likely to meet her?" asked Paul, with repugnance. "Yes, I fancy so. After all, you are engaged to the daughter of the dead man, and Mrs. Krill, I don't count Maud, who is a tool, is a deucedly clever woman. She will keep her eye on you and Miss Norman." "Why? She has the money, and need take no further notice." Hurd closed one eye in a suggestive manner. "Mrs. Krill may not be so sure of the money, even though possession is 9 points of the law. You remember that scrap of paper found by the maid, in which Norman warned Sylvia against allowing his real name to become known?" "Yes." "Well, the letter wasn't finished. The old man was interrupted, I suppose. But in the few lines of writing Norman says," here Hurd took a scrap of paper, a copy, out of his book, and read, "If the name of Krill gets into the papers, there will be great trouble. Keep it from the public. I can tell you where to find the reasons for this, as I have written." "And then," said Hurd, refolding the paper, "the writing ends. But you can see that Aaron Norman wrote out an account of his reasons, which could not be pleasant for Mrs. Krill to hear." "I still don't understand," said Paul, hopelessly puzzled. "Well," said the detective, rising and putting on his smart hat, "it's rather a muddle, I confess. I have no reason to suspect Mrs. Krill." "Good heavens, Hurd, you don't think she killed her husband?" "No, I said that I have no reason to suspect her, but I don't like the woman at all. Norman left his wife for some unpleasant reason, and that reason, as I verily believe, has something to do with his death. I don't say that Mrs. Krill killed him, but I do believe that she knows of circumstances which may lead to the detection of the criminal. In that case she would save her £1,000. That's just where it is. If she does know, why does she double the reward? A straightforward woman would speak out, but she's a crooked sort of creature. I shouldn't like to have her for my enemy." "It seems to me that you do suspect her," said Paul dryly, but puzzled. Hurd shrugged his shoulders. "No, but I'm in a fix, that's the truth," said he, and sauntered toward the door. "I can't see my way. There's the clue of Mrs. Krill's past to be followed up, and the hint contained in the scrap of paper. The old man may have left a document behind likely to solve the whole business, He hints as much here." "True enough, but nothing was found." "Then again," went on Hurd, "the request for the jewels to be delivered to that sailor chap was in Norman's handwriting and signed with his name." "A forgery." "No. Pash, who knows his writing better than any other man, says the document is genuine. Now then, Mr. Beecot, what made Aaron Norman write and sign those lines giving up his property, or a part of it, just before his death?" "It may have been done in good faith." "No. If so, the messenger would not have cleared out when Pash started for Gwynne Street. That nautical gentleman knew what the lawyer would find at the house, and so made himself scarce after trying to get the jewels. This scrap of paper," Hurd touched his breast, "and that request for the jewels in Pash's possession, those are my clues." "And the Opal Serpent?" asked Paul. Hurd shook his head gloomily. "Its connection with the matter is beyond me," he confessed. Chapter 13. Chapter 14 of the Opal Serpent by Fergus Hume. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Mr. Hay's little dinner. The detective was as good as his word. In a few days Paul was introduced to the editor of a weekly publication and obtained a commission for a story to be written in collaboration with Mr. Hurd. It seemed that the editor was an old acquaintance of Hurd's and had been extricated by him from some trouble connected with cards. The editor, to show his gratitude, and because that Hurd's experiences, thrown in the form of a story, could not fail to interest the public, was only too willing to make a liberal arrangement. Also Paul was permanently engaged to supply short stories, to read those that were submitted to the editor, and, in fact, he permanently became that gentleman's right hand. He was a kind, beery Bohemian of an editor, Scott by name, and took quite a fancy to Paul. "I'll give you £3 a week," said Scott, beaming through his large spectacles and raking his long gray beard with tobacco-stained fingers. "You can live on that, and to earn it you can give me your opinion on the stories. Then between whiles you can talk to Hurd and write this yarn, which I am sure will be interesting. Hurd has had some queer experiences." This was quite true. Hurd had ventured on strange waters, but the strangest he ever sailed on were those connected with the Gwynne Street case. These latter experiences he did not tell to Scott, who was incapable of holding his tongue, and secrecy, as the detective impressed upon Paul, was absolutely necessary to the conduct of the case. "If we keep matters quiet," argued Hurd, "and let those concerned in the matter fancy the case has been dropped, we'll be able to throw them off their guard, and then they may betray themselves." "I wish you would say if you think there is one person or two," said Paul irritably, for his nerves were wearing thin under the strain. "You first talk of the assassin and then of the assassins." "Well," drawled Hurd, smiling, "I'm in the dark, you see, and being only a flesh and blood human being, instead of a creation of one of you authors, I can only grope in the dark and look in every direction for the light. One person, two persons, three, even four, may be engaged in this affair for all I know. Don't you be in a hurry, Mr. Beecot. I believe in that foreign chap's saying, 'Without haste, without rest.'" "Goethe said that." "Then Goethe is a sensible man, and must have read his Bible. 'Make no haste in time of trouble,' says the Scriptures." "Very good," assented Beecot. "Take your own time." "I intend to," said Hurd, coolly. "Bless you, slow and sure is my motto. There's no hurry. You are fixed up with enough to live on, and a prospect of making more. Your young lady is happy enough with that grenadier of a woman, in spite of the humbleness of the home. Mrs. Krill and her daughter are enjoying the 5,000 a year, and Mr. Grexon Hay is fleecing that young ass Lord George Sandal as easily as possible. I stand by and watch everything, and when the time comes, I'll pounce down on—" "Ah," said Paul, "that's the question. On whom?" "One, or two, or a baker's dozen," rejoined Hurd, calmly. "My chickens ain't hatched yet, so I don't count 'em. By the way, is your old schoolfellow as friendly as ever?" "Yes. Why?" "I can't understand, as he certainly will make no money out of me. He's giving a small dinner to morrow night at his rooms, and has asked me." "You go," said the detective, emphatically, "and don't let on you have anything to do with me." "See here, Hurd, I won't play the spy, if you mean that." "I don't mean anything of the sort," replied Hurd, earnestly. "But if you do chance to meet Mrs. Krill at this dinner, and if she does chance to drop a few words about her past, you might let me know." "Oh, I don't mind doing that," said Beecot, with relief. "I am as anxious to find out the truth about this murder as you are, if not more so. The truth, I take it, is to be found in Krill's past, before he took the name of Norman. Mrs. Krill will know of that past, and I'll try and learn all I can from her. But Hay has nothing to do with the crime, and I won't spy on him." "Very good. Do what you like. But as to Hay having nothing to do with the matter, I still think Hay stole that opal brooch from you when you were knocked down." "In that case Hay must know who killed Norman," cried Paul, excited. "He just does," rejoined Hurd, calmly. "And now you can understand another reason why I take such an interest in that gentleman." "But you can't be certain." "Quite so. I am in the dark, as I said before. But Hay is a dangerous man, and would do anything to rake in the dollars. He has something to do with the disappearance of that brooch, I'm sure, and if so, he knows more than he says. Besides," here Hurd hesitated. "No, I'll tell you that later." "Tell me what?" "Something about Hay that will astonish you and make you think he has something to do with the crime. Meanwhile, learn all you can from Mrs. Krill." "If I meet her," said Paul, with a shrug. Undoubtedly Hurd knew more than he was prepared to admit, and not even to Paul, staunch as he knew him to be, would he speak confidentially. When the time came the detective would speak out. At present he held his tongue, and moved in clouds like a Homeric deity. But his eyes were on all those connected with the late Aaron Norman, indirectly or directly, although each and every one of them were unaware of the scrutiny. Paul had no scruples in learning all he could from Mrs. Krill. He did not think that she had killed her husband, and probably might be ignorant of the person or persons who had slain the poor wretch in such a cruel manner. But the motive of the crime was to be found in Norman's past, and Mrs. Krill knew all about this. Therefore Paul was very pleased when he found that Mrs. Krill and her daughter were guests at the little dinner. Hay's rooms were large and luxuriously furnished. In effect, he occupied a small flat in the house of an ex-butler, and had furnished the place himself in a sybarite fashion. The ex-butler and his wife and servants looked after Hay, and, in addition, that languid gentleman possessed a slim valet, with a sly face, who looked as though he knew more than was good for him. Indeed, the whole atmosphere of the rooms was shady and fast, and Paul, simple young fellow as he was, felt the bad influence the moment he stepped into the tiny drawing room. This was furnished daintily and with great taste in color and furnishings. It was more like a woman's room, and Mr. Hay had spared no cost in making it pleasing to the eye and comfortable to the body. The prevailing tone was pale yellow, and the electric light suffused itself through lemon-shaded globes. The Louis Quinze furniture was upholstered in primrose, and there were many Persian praying mats and Eastern draperies about the place. Water-color pictures decked the walls, and numerous mirrors reflected the dainty, pretty apartment. A brisk fire was burning, although the evening was not cold, and everything looked delightfully pleasant. Paul could not help contrasting all this luxury and taste with his bare garret. But with Sylvia's love to warm his heart, he would not have changed places with Grexon Hay for all his splendor. Two ladies were seated by the fire. Mrs. Krill in black, majestic and calm as usual. She wore diamonds on her breast and jeweled stars in her gray hair. Although not young, she was a wonderfully well preserved woman, and her arms and neck were white, gleaming and beautifully shaped. From the top of her head to the sole of her rather large but well shod foot, she was dressed to perfection, and waved a languid fan as she welcomed Paul, who was presented to her by the host. "I am glad to see you, Mr. Beecot," she said in her deep voice. "We had rather an unhappy interview when last we met. How is Miss Norman?" "She is quite well," replied Paul, in as cordial a tone as he could command. For the sake of learning what he could, he wished to be amiable, but it was difficult when he reflected that this large, suave, smiling woman had robbed Sylvia of a fortune and had spoken of her in a contemptuous way. But Beecot, swallowing down his pride, held his little candle to the devil without revealing his repugnance too openly, and apparently Mrs. Krill believed that his composure was genuine enough, for she was quite at her ease in his presence. The daughter was dressed like the mother, save that she wore pearls in place of diamonds. She talked but little, as usual, and sat smiling, the young image of the older woman. Hay also introduced Paul to a handsome young fellow of 21, with rather a feeble face. This was Lord George Sandal, the pigeon Hay was plucking, and although he had charming manners and an assumption of worldly wisdom, he was evidently one of those who had come into the world saddled and bridled for other folks' riding. A third lady was also present, who called herself Aurora Quean, and Hay informed his friend in a whisper that she was an actress. Paul then remembered that he had seen her name in the papers as famous in light comedy. She was pretty and kittenish, with fluffy hair and an eternal smile. It was impossible to imagine a greater contrast to the massive firmness of Mrs. Krill than the lively, girlish demeanor of the little woman. Yet Paul had an instinct that Mrs. Quean, in spite of her profession and odd name and childish giggle, was a more shrewd person than she looked. Everyone was bright and merry and chatty, all save Maud Krill, who smiled and fanned herself in a statuesque way. Hay paid her great attention, and Paul knew very well that he intended to marry the silent woman for her money. It would be hardly earned, he thought, with such a firm-looking mother-in-law as Mrs. Krill would certainly prove to be. The dinner was delightful, well cooked, daintily served, and leisurely eaten. A red shaded lamp threw a rosy light on the white cloth, the glittering crystal and bright silver. The number of diners was less than the Muses and more than the Graces, and everyone laid himself or herself out to make things bright. And again Maud Krill may be mentioned as an exception. She ate well and held her tongue, merely smiling heavily when addressed. Paul glanced at her serene face across the rosy hued table, wondering if she really was as calm as she looked, and if she really lacked the brain power her mother seemed to possess. "I am glad to see you here, Beecot," said Hay, smiling. "I am very glad to be here," said Paul, adapting himself to circumstances, "especially in such pleasant company." "You don't go out much," said Lord George. "No, I am a poor author who has yet to win his spurs." "I thought of being an author myself," said the young man, "but it was such a fag to think about things." "You want your material supplied to you, perhaps," put in Mrs. Krill in a calm, contemptuous way. "Oh, no. If I wrote stories like the author Johnnies, I'd rake up my family history. There's lots of fun there." "Your family mightn't like it," giggled Miss Qian. "I know lots of things about my own people which would read delightfully if Mr. Beecot set them down, but then she shrugged her dainty shoulders. Oh, dear me, what a row there would be. "I suppose there's a skeleton in every cupboard," said Hay, suavely, and quite ignoring the shady tenant in his own. "There's a whole dozen cupboards with skeletons to match in my family," said the young lord. "Why, I had an aunt, Lady Rachel Sandal, who was murdered over 20 years ago. Now," he said, looking triumphantly round the table, "which of you can say there's a murder in your family, ladies and gentlemen?" Paul glanced sideways at Mrs. Krill, wondering what she would say, and wondering also how it was that Lord George did not know she was the widow of the murdered Lemuel Krill, whose name had been so widely advertised. But Hay spoke before anyone could make a remark. "What an unpleasant subject," he said, with a pretended shudder. "Let us talk of less melodramatic things." "Oh, why?" said Mrs. Krill, using her fan. "I rather like to hear about murders." Paul thought for a moment that he did know about the Gwynne Street crime, and intended to remark thereon. But if so, his good taste told him that he would be ill advised to speak, and he turned to ask for another glass of wine. Miss Aurora Quean looked in her pretty shrewd way from one to the other. "I just love the Newgate Calendar," she said, clasping her hands. "There's lovely plots for dramas to be found there. Don't you think so, Mr. Beecot?" "I don't read that sort of literature, Miss Qian." "And then you don't know what people are capable of in the way of cruelty, Mr. Beecot." "I don't want to know," retorted Paul, finding the subject distasteful, and wondering why the actress pressed it, as she undoubtedly did. "I prefer to write stories to elevate the mind." Miss Qian made a grimace and shot a meaning look at him. "It doesn't pay," she said, tittering, "and money is what we all want." "I fear I don't care for money overmuch." "No," said Mrs. Krill to him in an undertone. "I know that from the way you spoke in Mr. Pash's office." "I was standing up for the rights of another." "You will be rewarded," she replied meaningly, but what she did mean Paul could not understand. The rest of the dinner passed off well enough. As the subject was changed, Lord George began to talk of racing, and Hay responded. Mrs. Krill alone seemed shocked. "I don't believe in gambling," she said icily. "I hope you're not very down on it," said Hay. "Lord George and I propose to play bridge with you ladies in the next room." "Maud can play and Miss Qian," said the widow. "I'll talk to Mr. Beecot, unless he prefers the fascination of the green cloth." "I would rather talk to you," replied Paul, bowing. Mrs. Krill nodded, and then went out of the room with the younger ladies. The three gentlemen filled their glasses with port, and Hay passed round a box of cigars. Soon they were smoking and chatting in a most amicable fashion. Lord George talked a great deal about racing and cards, and his bad luck with both. Hay said very little, and every now and then cast a glance at Paul to see how he was taking the conversation. At length, when Sandal became a trifle vehement on the subject of his losses, Hay abruptly changed the subject by refilling his glass and those of his companions. "I want you to drink to the health of my future bride," he said. "What?" cried Paul, staring. "Miss Krill?" "The same," responded Hay, coldly. "You see I have taken your advice and intend to settle. Pash presented me to the ladies when next they came to his office, and since then I have been almost constantly with them. Miss Krill's affections were disengaged, and she, therefore, with her mother's consent, became my promised wife." "I wish you joy," said Lord George, draining his glass and filling another, "and by Jove, for your sake, I hope she's got money." "Oh, yes, she's well off," said Hay, calmly. "And you, Paul?" "I congratulate you, of course," stammered Beecot, dazed. "But it's so sudden. You haven't known her above a month." "5 weeks or so," said Hay, smiling, and sinking his voice lower. He added, "I can't afford to let grass grow under my feet. This young ass here may snap her up, and Mrs. Krill would only be too glad to secure a title for Maud." "I say," said Lord George suddenly, and waking from a brown study, "who is Mrs. Krill? I've heard the name." "It is not an uncommon name," said Hay, untruthfully and quickly. "She is a rich widow who has lately come to London." "Where did she come from?" "I can't tell you that. From the wilds of Yorkshire, I believe. You had better ask her." "Oh, by Jove, no. I wouldn't be so rude. But I seem to know the name." Paul privately thought that if he read the papers he ought to certainly know the name, and he was on the point of making perhaps an injudicious remark, but Hay pointedly looked at him in such a meaning way that he held his tongue. More, when they left their wine for the society of the ladies, Hay squeezed his friend's arm in the passage. "Don't mention the death," he said, using a politer word by preference. "Sandal doesn't connect Mrs. Krill with the dead man. She wants to live the matter down." "In that case she ought to leave London for a time." "She intends to. When I make Maud my wife, we will travel with her mother for a year or two, until the scandal of the murder blows over." Luckily the name of Lemuel Krill was not mentioned often in the papers, and Sandal hasn't seen a handbill that I know of. I suppose you agree with me that silence is judicious?" "Yes," assented Paul, "I think it is." "And you congratulate me on my approaching marriage?" "Certainly. Now perhaps you will live like Falstaff when he was made a knight." Hay did not understand the allusion and looked puzzled. However, he had no time to say more as they entered the drawing room. Almost as soon as they did, Mrs. Krill summoned Paul to her side. "And now," she said, "let us talk of Miss Norman." Chapter 15. Chapter 15 of the Opal Serpent by Fergus Hume. This recording is in the public domain. A new clue. "I don't wish to talk of Miss Norman," said Paul bluntly. "Then you can be no true lover," retorted the widow. "I disagree with you. A true lover does not talk to all and sundry concerning the most sacred feelings of his heart. Moreover, your remarks at our last meeting were not to my taste." "I apologize," said Mrs. Krill promptly, "and will not offend in that way again. I did not know you then, but since Mr. Hay has spoken about you to me, I know and appreciate you, Mr. Beecot." But Paul was not to be cajoled in this manner. The more suave the woman was, the more he felt inclined to be on his guard, and he very wisely obeyed the prompting of his instinct. "I fear you do not know me, Mrs. Krill," said he, as coldly as Hay could have spoken, "else you would hardly ask me to discuss with you, of all people, the lady whom I intend to make my wife." "You are rather a difficult man to deal with," she replied, drawing her thick white eyebrows together. "But I like difficult men. That is why I admire Mr. Hay. He is not a silly, useless butterfly like that young lord there." "Silly he is not, but I doubt his being useful. So far as I can see, Hay looks after himself and nobody else." "He proposes to look after my daughter." "So I understand," replied Beecot politely, "but that is a matter entirely for your own consideration." Mrs. Krill still continued to smile in her placid way, but she was rather nonplussed all the same. From the appearance of Beecot, she had argued that he was one of those many men she could twist round her finger, but he seemed to be less easily guided than she expected, and for the moment she was silent, letting her hard eyes wander toward the card table, round which sat the four playing an eager and engrossing game of bridge. "You don't approve of that, perhaps?" "No," said Paul calmly, "I certainly do not." "Are you a Puritan, may I ask?" Beecot shook his head and laughed. "I am a simple man who tries to do his duty in this world," said he, "and who very often finds it difficult to do that same duty." "How do you find duty, Mr. Beecot?" "We are becoming ethical," said Paul with a smile. "I don't know that I am prepared with an answer at present." "Then the next time we meet, for I hope," said Mrs. Krill, smoothing her face to a smile, it had grown rather somber, "that we shall often meet again. You must come and see us. We have taken a house in Kensington." "Chosen by Mr. Hay?" "Yes, he is our mentor in London society. I don't think," added Mrs. Krill, studying his face, "that you like Mr. Hay." "As I am Mr. Hay's guest," said Paul dryly, "that is rather an unkind question to ask." "I asked no question. I simply made a statement." Beecot found the conversation rather embarrassing. In place of his pumping Mrs. Krill, she was trying to pump him, which reversal of his design he by no means approved of. He changed the subject of conversation by drawing a powerfully attractive red herring across the trail. "You wish to speak to me about Miss Norman," he remarked. "I do," answered Mrs. Krill, who saw through his design, "but apparently that subject is as distasteful as a discussion about Mr. Hay." "Both subjects are rather personal, I admit, Mrs. Krill. However, if you have anything to tell me which you would like Miss Norman to hear, I am willing to listen." "Ah, now you are more reasonable," she answered in a pleased tone. "It is simply this, Mr. Beecot. I am very sorry for the girl. Through no fault of her own she is placed in a difficult position. I cannot give her a name, since her father sinned against her as he sinned in another way against me, but I can, through my daughter who is guided by me, give her an income. It does not seem right that I should have all this money." "That your daughter should have all this money," interpolated Beecot. "My daughter and I are one," replied Mrs. Krill, calmly. "When I speak for myself, I speak for her. But, as I say, it doesn't seem right we should be in affluence and Miss Norman in poverty. So I propose to allow her $500 a year, on conditions. Will she accept, do you think, Mr. Beecot?" "I should think her acceptance would depend upon the conditions." "They are very simple," said Mrs. Krill, in her deep tones, and looking very straight at Paul. "She is to marry you and go to America." Beecot's face did not change, since her hard eyes were on it, but he was puzzled under his mask of indifference. Why did this woman want Sylvia to marry him and go into exile? He temporized. "With regard to your wish that Miss Norman should marry me," he said quietly, "it is of course very good of you to interest yourself in the matter. I fail to understand your reason, however." "Yet the reason is patent," rejoined Mrs. Krill, just as quietly and quite as watchful as before. "Sylvia Norman is a young girl without much character." "In that I disagree with you." "Well, let us admit she has character, but she certainly has no experience. In the world she is exposed to much trouble and perhaps, maybe, to temptation. Since her position is the fault of her father, and she is entirely innocent, I want her to have a happy life. For that reason I wish her to marry you." Paul bowed, not believing a word of this philanthropic speech. "Again I say it is good of you," said he, with some irony, "but even were I out of the way, her nurse, Deborah Tawsey, would look after her. As matters stand, however, she will certainly become my wife as soon as we can afford a home." "You can afford it to morrow," said Mrs. Krill, eagerly, "if you will accept my offer." "A home in America," said Paul, "and why?" "I should think both of you would like to be away from a place where you have seen such a tragedy." "Indeed." Paul committed himself to no opinion. "And supposing we accept your offer, which I admit is a generous one, you suggest we should go to the States?" "Or to Canada, or Australia, or in fact, you can go anywhere so long as you leave England. I tell you, Mr. Beecot, even at the risk of hurting your feelings, that I want that girl away from London. My husband treated me very badly. He was a brute always, and I hate to have that girl before my eyes." "Yet she is innocent." "Have I not said that a dozen times?" rejoined Mrs. Krill, impatiently. "What is the use of further discussion? Do you accept my offer?" "I will convey it to Miss Norman. It is for her to decide." "But you have the right, since you are to be her husband." "Pardon me, no.
I would never take such a responsibility on me. I shall tell Miss Norman what you say, and convey her answer to you." "Thank you," said Mrs. Krill, graciously, but she was annoyed that her golden bait had not been taken immediately, and in spite of her suavity, Paul could see that she was annoyed, the more so when she began to explain. "Of course you understand my feelings." "I confess I don't quite. Naturally the fact that you are connected with the murder in the public eyes—" "Pardon me," said the woman swiftly, "but I am not. The name of Krill has hardly been noticed. The public know that Aaron Norman was murdered. No one talks of Lemuel Krill, or thinks that I am the widow of the murdered man. Possibly I may come across some people who will connect the two names and look askance at me, but the majority of people, such as Lord George there," she pointed with her fan, "do not think of me in the way you say. As he did, they will think they remember the name." "Lord George did not say that to you," said Paul, swiftly. "No, but he did to Mr. Hay, who told me," rejoined Mrs. Krill, quite as swiftly. "To night?" asked Beecot, remembering that Hay had not spoken privately to Miss Krill since they came in from the dining room. "Oh, no, on another occasion. Lord George has several times said that he has a faint recollection of my name. Possibly the connection between me and the murder may occur to his mind, but he is really so very stupid that I hope he will forget all about the matter." "I wonder you don't change your name," said Paul, looking at her. "Certainly not, unless public opinion forces me to change it," she said defiantly. "My life has always been perfectly open and above board, not like that of my husband." "Why did he change his name?" asked Beecot, eagerly, too eagerly in fact, for she drew back. "Why do you ask?" she inquired coldly. Paul shrugged his shoulders. "An idle question, Mrs. Krill. I have no wish to force your confidence." "There is no forcing in the matter," responded the woman. "I have taken quite a fancy to you, Mr. Beecot, and you shall know what I do." "Pray do not tell me if you would rather not." "But I would rather," said Mrs. Krill, bluntly. "It will prevent your misconception of anything you may hear about us. My husband's real name was Lemuel Krill, and he married me 30 years ago. I will be frank with you and admit that neither of us were gentlefolks. We kept a public house on the outskirts of Christchurch in Hants called the Red Pig." She looked anxiously at him as she spoke. "A strange name. Have you never heard of it before?" "No. Had I heard the name it would have remained in my memory, from its oddity." Paul might have been mistaken, but Mrs. Krill certainly seemed relieved. Yet if she had anything to conceal in connection with the Red Pig, why should she have mentioned the name? "It is not a first class hotel," she went on smoothly, and again with her false smile. "We had only farm labourers and such like as customers, but the custom was good and we did very well. Then my husband took to drink." "In that respect he must have changed," said Paul quickly. "For all the time I knew him, 6 months it was, I never saw him the worse for drink, and I certainly never heard from those who would be likely to know that he indulged in alcohol to excess. All the same," added Paul, with an afterthought of his conversation with Sylvia in the Embankment garden, "I fancied from his pale face and shaking hands and a tightness of the skin that he might drink." "Exactly. He did. He drank brandy in large quantities, and strange to say he never got drunk." "What do you mean exactly?" asked Beecot, curiously. "Well," said Mrs. Krill, biting the top of her fan and looking over it, "Lemuel, I'll call him by the old name, never grew red in the face, and even after years of drinking he never showed any sign of intemperance. Certainly his hands would shake at times, but I never noticed particularly the tightness of the skin you talk of." "A certain shiny look," explained Paul. "Quite so. I never noticed it. But he never got drunk so as to lose his head or his balance," went on Mrs. Krill, "but he became a demon." "A demon?" "Yes," said the woman emphatically. "As a rule he was a timid, nervous little man, like a frightened rabbit, and would not harm a fly. but drink, as you know, changes a nature to the contrary of what it actually is." "I have heard that." "You would have seen an example in Lemuel," she retorted. "When he drank brandy he became a king, a sultan. From being timid he became bold. From not harming anyone he was capable of murder. Often in his fits did he lay violent hands on me, but I managed to escape. When sober he would moan and apologize in a provokingly tearful manner. I hated and despised him," she went on, with flashing eyes, but careful to keep her voice from reaching the gamblers. "I was a fool to marry him. My father was a farmer, and I had a good education. I was attracted by the good looks of Lemuel, and ran away with him from my father's farm in Buckinghamshire." "That's where Stowley is," murmured Paul. "Stowley?" echoed Mrs. Krill, whose ears were very sharp. "Yes, I know that town. Why do you mention it?" "The opal serpent brooch with which your husband's lips were fastened was pawned there." "I remember," said Mrs. Krill, calmly. "Mr. Pash told me. It has never been found out how the brooch came to fasten the lips. So horrible it was." She shuddered. "No, my father bought the brooch from the Stowley pawnbroker, and gave it to my mother, who sent it to me. When I had an accident I lost it, but who picked it up I can't say." "The assassin must have picked it up," declared Mrs. Krill, decisively, "else it would not have been used in that cruel way. Though why such a brooch should have been used at all, I can't understand. I suppose my husband did not tell you why he wanted to buy the brooch?" "Who told you that he did?" asked Paul, quickly. "Mr. Pash. He told me all about the matter, but not the reason why my husband wanted the brooch." "Pash doesn't know," said Beecot, "nor do I. Your husband fainted when I first showed him the brooch, but I don't know why. He said nothing." Again Mrs. Krill's face, in spite of her care, showed a sense of relief at his ignorance. "But I must get back to my story," she said, in a hard tone. "We have to leave soon. I ran away with Lemuel, who was then travelling with jewellery. He knew a good deal about jewellery, you know, which he turned to account in his pawnbroking." "Yes, and amassed a fortune thereby." "I should never have credited him with so much sense," said Mrs. Krill, contemptuously. "While at Christchurch he was nothing but a drunkard, whining when sober, and a furious beast when drunk. I managed all the house, and looked after my little daughter. Lemuel led me a dog's life, and we quarrelled incessantly. At length, when Maud was old enough to be my companion, Lemuel ran away. I kept on the red pig, and waited for him to return, but he never came back, and for over 20 years I heard nothing of him, till I saw the handbills and his portrait, and heard of his death. Then I came to see Mr. Pash, and the rest you know." "But why did he run away?" asked Paul. "I suppose he grew weary of the life and the way I detested him," was her reply. "I don't wonder he ran away. But there, I have told you all, so make what you can of it. Tell Miss Norman of my offer, and make her see the wisdom of accepting it. And now," she rose and held out her hand, "I must run away. You will call and see us. Mr. Hay will give you the address." "What's that?" said Hay, leaving the card table. "Does Beecot want your address?" "Certainly." He went to a table and scribbled on a card. "There you are, Hunter Street, Kensington, number 32A. Do come, Beecot. I hope soon to call on your services to be my best man." And he cast a coldly loving look on Maud, who simply smiled as usual. By this time the card party had broken up. Maud had lost a few pounds, and Lord George a great deal, but Miss Qian and Hay had won. "What luck!" groaned the young lord. "Everything seems to go wrong with me." "Stop, and we'll try another game when the ladies have gone," suggested Hay, his impassive face lighting up. Then Beecot. "I must go," said the young gentleman, who did not wish to be called upon as a witness in a possible card scandal. "And I'll go too," said Lord George. "Whenever I play with you, Hay, I always seem to lose." "What do you mean by that?" asked Grexon, fiercely. "Oh, he doesn't mean anything," said Miss Qian, sweetly, and putting her cloak around her. "Mr. Beecot, just take me to my cab." "I'll take you to your carriage," said Hay, offering an arm to Mrs. Krill, which she accepted graciously. Lord George followed, grumbling, with the ever smiling Maud. Miss Qian skipped into a hansom and offered Paul a drive back to town, which he refused. As the cab was driving off, she bent down and whispered, "Be careful," with a side glance at Hay. Paul laughed. Everyone seemed to doubt Hay, but that gentleman handed Mrs. Krill and her daughter into their carriage and looked towards Lord George. "You don't want your revenge tonight?" he asked. "No, confound you," said the young man, sulkily. "In that case I'll drive into Kensington with Mrs. Krill, and borrow her carriage for a trip to Piccadilly. Good night, Sandal. Good night, Beecot." He waved his hand, and the ladies waved theirs, and then the three drove away. Lord George lighted a cigar, and putting his arm within that of Beecot, strolled down the road. "Come to my club," he said. "No, thank you," answered Paul, politely. "I must get home." "But I wish you'd come. I hate being by myself, and you seem such a good sort of chap." "Well," said Beecot, thinking he might say a word in season to this young fool, "I don't gamble." "Oh, you cry down that, do you?" "Well, I think it's foolish." "It is," assented Lord George, frankly, "infernally foolish. And Hay has all the luck. I wonder if he plays square." This was dangerous ground, and Paul shied. "I really can't say," he said coldly. "I don't play cards." "But what do you know of Hay?" asked Sandal. "Only that he was at school with me in Torrington. We met by accident the other day, and he asked me to dinner." "Torrington, yes. I had a brother at that school once," said Lord George. "But you and Hay wouldn't get on well together, I should think. You're straight, and he's—" "You forget we have been dining with him," said Paul, quickly. "What of that? I've dined often, and have paid pretty dearly for the privilege. I must have lost at least 5,000 to him within the last few months." "In that case I should advise you to play cards no more. The remedy is easy," said Paul, dryly. "It isn't so easy to leave off cards," rejoined Sandal, gloomily. "I'm that fond of gambling that I only seem to live when I've got the cards or dice in my hand. I suppose it's like dram drinking." "If you take my advice, Lord George, you will give up card playing." "With Hay, do you mean?" asked the other, shrewdly. "With any one. I know nothing about Hay beyond what I have told you." Said Sandal. "I don't think you're a chap like him at all. I may look a fool, but I ain't, and can see through a brick wall, same as most Johnnies." "Who can't see at all?" interpolated Paul, dryly. "Ha, ha, that's good. But I say about this Hay. What a queer lot he had there to night." "I can't discuss that," said Paul, stiffly. He was not one to eat a man's bread and salt and then betray him. Sandal went on as though he hadn't heard him. "That actress is a jolly little woman," said he. "I've seen her at the Frivolity. A ripping fine singer and dancer she is. But those other ladies—" "Mrs. and Miss Krill?" The young lord stopped short in the High Street. "Where have I heard that name?" he said, looking up to the stars. "Somewhere in the country, maybe. I go down sometimes to the Hall, my father's place. I don't suppose you know it. It's 3 miles from Christchurch." "In Hants?" said Paul, feeling he was on the verge of a discovery. "Yes. Have you been there?" "No, but I have heard of the place. There's a hotel there called the Red Pig, which I thought—" "Ha!" cried young Sandal, stopping again, and with such a shout that passers-by thought he was drunk. "I remember the name, the Red Pig. A woman called Krill kept that." "She can hardly be the same," said Paul, not wishing to betray the lady. "No, I guess not. She'd hardly have the cheek to sit down with me if she did. But Krill, yes, I remember. My aunt, you know." "Your aunt?" "Yes," said Sandal, impatiently. "She was murdered or committed suicide in that Red Pig place. Rachel Sandal. with her unlucky opals." "Her unlucky opals? What do you mean?" "Why, she had a serpent set with opals she wore as a brooch, and it brought her bad luck." Chapter 15.
Chapter 16 of the Opal Serpent by Fergus Hume. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Sylvia's Theory. It was close upon midnight when Paul reached his garret. Sandal drove him in a hansom cab as far as Piccadilly Circus, and from that place Beecot walked through Oxford Street to Bloomsbury. He had not been able to extract further information of any importance from the young lord. It appeared that Lady Rachel Sandal, in love with an inferior, had quarrelled with her father, and had walked to Christchurch one night with the intention of joining the man she wished to marry in London. But the night was stormy, and Lady Rachel was a frail woman. She took refuge in the Red Pig, intending to go the next morning. But during the night she was found strangled in the bedroom she had hired. Sandal could give no details, as the events happened before he was born, and he had only heard scraps of the dreadful story. "Some people say Lady Rachel was murdered," explained Sandal, "and others that she killed herself. But the opal brooch which she wore certainly disappeared. But there was such a scandal over the affair that my grandfather hushed it up. I can't say exactly what took place, but I know it happened at a small pub kept by a woman called Krill. Do you think this woman is the same?" "It's hardly likely," said Paul, mendaciously. "How could a woman who kept a small public house become suddenly rich?" "True," answered Lord George, as they stopped in the Circus, "and she'd have let on she knew about my name had she anything to do with the matter. All the same, I'll ask her." "Do so," said Paul, stepping out of the cab. He was perfectly satisfied that Mrs. Krill was quite equal to deceiving Sandal. The wonder was that she had not held her peace to him about the Red Pig. "You won't come on to my club?" asked Sandal, leaning out of the cab. "No, thank you," replied Paul. "Good night," and he walked away. The fact is, Beecot wished to put on paper all that he had heard that night and send it to Hurd. As soon as he reached his attic, he set to work and wrote out a detailed account of the evening. "You might find out if Lady Rachel committed suicide, or whether she was strangled by someone else," ended Beecot. "Certainly the mention of the serpent brooch is curious. This may be the event in Norman's past life which led him to change his name." Paul wrote much more, and then went out to post the letter. It was after midnight when he did, so there was not much chance of Hurd getting the letter before the second or third post the next day. But Paul felt that he had done his duty, and he had supplied the information as speedily as possible. So he went to sleep with a quiet mind, in spite of the excitement of the evening. But next morning he was unable to sit down to his desk as usual, and felt disinclined to go to the newspaper office. So he walked to Jubileetown to see how Sylvia was getting along. Deborah met him at the gate. "Well, I never, Mr. Beecot," said Mrs. Tawsey, with her red arms akimbo in her usual attitude. "This is a sight for sore eyes. Won't my pretty be happy this day, say what you may?" "She's a making out bills for the washing that's done, bless her heart, for a clever beauty." "How is business?" asked Paul, entering the gate, which Deborah opened. "Bless you, Mr. Beecot, I'll be a lady of fortune soon," answered the proprietress of the laundry. "The way washings has come in is just amazing. One would think folks never had no linen done up before, and that they never did have," said Deborah, rubbing her nose hard. "In my way, which is a way. If you'd only send along your shirts, Mr. Beecot, I'd be proud to show you what can be done with fronts, and no thumb nails down them to spoil their loveliness." Paul did not reply to this, but laughed absently. He was wondering if Deborah had ever heard her master drop any hint as to his having come from the place where Mrs. Krill resided,
and asked the question on the spur of the moment. "Do you know Christ Church in Hants?" Deborah rubbed her nose harder and looked at him doubtfully. "Me as said as I'd have no relatives must tell the truth now as I have," said she rather incoherently, "for my sister, Tilly Junk, worked for someone in that there place for years, but we never got on well, she being upsetting and masterful, so ask her to my wedding I didn't, and denied relatives existing, which they do, she being alive 10 years ago when she last wrote." "You have not heard from her since?" asked Paul inquisitively. "Sir, you may burn me, or prison me, or put me in pillories," said Mrs. Tawsey, "but deceive you I won't. Me and Tilly not being of happy matching don't correspond." "We're London both," exclaimed Deborah, "father having been a hawker, but why she went to the country, or why I stopped in Gwynne Street, no one knows. And may I ask, Mr. Beecot, why you ask of that place?" "Your late master came from Christ Church, Mrs. Tawsey. Did you never hear him mention it?" "That I never did, for close he was, Mr. Beecot. Say what you like. I never knowed but what he'd pawned and sold them bookses all his blessed life, for all the talking he did. If I'd ha' knowed," added Deborah, lifting her red finger, "and as he'd been married afore and intended to cast out my lovely queen, I'd have strangled him myself." "He had no intention of casting out Sylvia," said Paul, musingly. "He certainly left the money to her." "Then why have the other girl got it?" "Sylvia's name wasn't mentioned, and Miss Krill is legally entitled as the legitimate daughter." "Call her what you like, she's a cat, as her mother is afore her," said Mrs. Tawsey indignantly, "and not young at that. 30 and over as I'm a living woman." "Oh, I don't think Miss Krill is as old as that." "Being a man you wouldn't, sir, men being blind to wrinklings and paint. But paint she do, the hussy, and young she ain't. Over 30, if I die for the saying of it." "But Mrs. Krill was married to your master only 30 years ago." "The more shame to her," snapped Deborah, masterfully, "for she ain't an honest woman if the signs of age is believing. Will I write to my sister Tilly, as I don't love Mr. Beecot, and ask if she knowed master when he was in that there place, which she can't 'ave, seeing she's been there but 10 years and he away 20. No, Deborah, you'd better say nothing. The case is in Hurd's hands. I'll tell him what you say and leave the matter to him. But you must be deceived about Miss Krill's age." "I've got 2 eyes and a nose," retorted Miss Tawsey, "so don't talk of deceivin's. 30 and more she is, the hussy. Let her Jezebel of a ma lie as she like, and can say what you will, Mr. Beecot. But there's my pretty smiling from the window, and the tub's a waiting, so you go in and smooth her to affections, while I see that Mrs. Purr irons the shirts, which she do lovely, there's no denying. Ho!" And Deborah plunged round the corner of the house, rampant and full of corn. Paul walked through the newly created garden, in which he saw many proofs of Sylvia's love for flowers, and reached the door in time to take the girl in his arms. She was flushed and joyful, and her eyes were as bright as stars. "Paul, darling," she said, as they entered the sitting room, where she was struggling with the accounts, "I'm so glad you are here. What's 9 times 9?" "81," said Paul, looking at the long list of figures Sylvia had been trying to add up. "Why do you make your head ache with these accounts, darling?" "I must help Debby, Paul, and I get on very well with the aid of arithmetic," and she pointed to a small school book which she had evidently been studying. "Let me take the burden from your shoulders," said her lover, smiling, and sat down at the table, which was strewn with bills. In about an hour he had arranged all these, and had made them out neatly to Deborah's various customers. Then he directed the envelopes, and Sylvia sealed them up. All the time they laughed and chatted, and despite the dull toil, thoroughly enjoyed themselves. "But I'm glad to see, Sylvia," said Beecot, pointing to 3 library volumes lying on the sofa, that you enjoy yourself occasionally?" "Oh," said Sylvia, pouncing on these, "I'm so glad you spoke. Paul, I wanted to say something to you. 'The Confessions of a Thug,'" she read out and looked at Paul. "Have you read it?" Beecot nodded. "By Colonel Meadows Taylor. A very interesting book, but rather a bloodthirsty one for you, dearest."
"Debby got it," confessed Miss Norman.
"Along with some other books from a literary customer who could not pay his bill. It is very strange, Paul, that the Confessions of a Thug should be amongst the books." "Really, I don't see why," smiled Beecot, fingering the old fashioned volumes. "It's the finger of fate, Paul," said Sylvia, solemnly. Then, seeing her lover look puzzled, "I mean that I should find out what gore is." "Gore?" Paul looked more puzzled than ever. "It's an Indian word," explained Sylvia, "and means coarse sugar. The Thugs eat it before they strangle anyone." "Oh," laughed Beecot, "and you think your father was strangled by a Thug. My dear child, the Thugs were stamped out years ago. You'll read all about it in the preface of that book, if I remember. But it's long since I read the work. Besides, darling," he added, drawing her to him caressingly, "the Thugs never came to England." "Paul," said Sylvia, still more solemnly, and resenting the laugh, "do you remember the Thug that came into the shop?" "Oh, you mean the street hawker that Bart spoke of? Yes, I remember that such an Indian entered, according to Bart's tale, and wanted to sell bootlaces, while that young imp Tray was dancing on poor Bart's body. But the Indian wasn't a Thug, Sylvia." "Yes, he was," she exclaimed excitedly. "Hokar, he said he was, and Hokar was a Thug. Remember the handful of coarse brown sugar he left on the counter? Didn't Bart tell you of that?" Paul started. "Yes, by Jove, he did," was his reply. "Well, then," said Sylvia, triumphantly, "that sugar was gore, and the Thugs eat it before strangling anyone, and father was strangled." Beecot could not but be impressed. "It is certainly very strange," he said, looking at the book, "and it was queer your father should have been strangled on the very night when this Indian Hokar left the sugar on the counter. A coincidence, Sylvia, darling." "No. Why should Hokar leave the sugar at all?" "Well, he didn't eat it, and therefore, if he was a Thug, he would have done so had he intended to strangle your father." "I don't know," said Sylvia, with a look of obstinacy on her pretty face. "But remember the cruel way in which my father was killed, Paul. It was just what an Indian would do. And then the sugar. Oh, I'm quite sure this hawker committed the crime."
Beecot shook his head and strove to dissuade her from entertaining this idea.
But Sylvia, usually so amenable to reason, refused to discard her theory, and indeed Paul himself thought that the incident of the sugar was queer. He determined to tell Hurd about the matter, and then the hawker might be found and made to explain why he had left the gore on a counter. "But the sect of the Thugs is extinct," argued Paul quickly. "It can't be, Sylvia." "But it is," she insisted, "I'm sure." And from this firm opinion he could not move her. Finally, when he departed, he took the books with him and promised to read the novel again. Perhaps something might come of Sylvia's fancy. The lovers spent the rest of the time in talking over their future, and Beecot looked hopefully towards making sufficient money to offer Sylvia a home. He also described to her how he had met Mrs. Krill and related what she was prepared to do. "Do you think we should accept the 500 a year, Paul?" said Sylvia, doubtfully. "It would put everything right, and so long as I am with you, I don't care where we live." "If you leave the decision to me, darling," said Paul, "I think it will be best to refuse this offer. Something is wrong, or Mrs. Krill would not be so anxious to get you out of the country." "Oh, Paul, do you think she knows anything about the murder?" "No, dear, I don't think that. Mrs. Krill is far too clever a woman to put her neck in danger. But there may be a chance of her daughter losing the money, Sylvia," he asked. "You saw Maud Krill. How old would you take her to be?" "Oh, quite old, Paul," said Sylvia, decisively. "She dresses well and paints her face, but she's 40." "Oh, Sylvia, not so much as that." "Well, then, 30 and over," insisted Sylvia. "Debby thinks the same as I do." "Don't you think Debby's zeal may lead her to exaggerate?" "It doesn't lead me to exaggerate," said Sylvia, slightly offended. "And I have eyes in my head as well as Debby. That girl, or that woman I should say, is over 30, Paul." "In that case," said Beecot, his color rising, "I fancy I see the reason of Mrs. Krill's desire to get you out of the country. Maud," he added deliberately, "may not be your father's daughter after all." "What makes you think that?" "Well, according to the marriage certificate, and to Mrs. Krill's admission, she was married to your father 30 years ago. If Maud is over 30, can't you see, Sylvia?" "Yes." Sylvia colored. "You mean she may be the same as I am?" "Not exactly, dear," replied Paul, soothing her. "I mean that Mrs. Krill may have been a widow and have had her little girl with her when she married your father. In that case Maud certainly could not get the money, and so Mrs. Krill wants you to leave England." "In case I would get it?" said Sylvia, excited. Paul looked puzzled and rather sad. "I can't say, dear," he replied doubtfully. "Certainly the money is left to my daughter, but as the marriage with your mother unfortunately is void, I fear you would not inherit. However," he said grimly, "there would be a certain pleasure in taking the money from that woman. Maud is a mere puppet in her hands," he laughed. "And then Hay would marry a poor bride," he ended maliciously. Sylvia could not quite understand all this, and gave up trying to solve the problem with a pretty gesture of indifference. "What will you do, Paul?" she asked. "I'll see Hurd and tell him what you and Deborah say about the age of Maud Krill." "Why not see Mr. Pash?" "Because he is a traitor," replied Beecot, darkly, "and, knowing he has lost your confidence, he will certainly try and give Maud Krill possession of the money. No, I'll speak to Hurd, who is my friend and yours. He is clever, and he will be able to unravel this tangle." "Tell him about the gore also, Paul." "Yes, I'll explain everything I can, and then I'll get him to go down to Christchurch and see what happened there when your father lived with Maud's mother." "What did happen, Paul?" asked Sylvia, anxiously. "Nothing," he replied, with an assumption of carelessness, for he did not want to tell the girl about the fate of Lady Rachel Sandal. "But we may find in your father's past life what led to his murder." "Do you think Mrs. Krill had anything to do with it?" "My own, you asked that question before. No, I don't. Still, one never knows. I should think Mrs. Krill is a dangerous woman, although I fancy too clever to risk being hanged. However, Hurd can find out if she was in town on the night your father was killed." "That was on the 6th of July," said Sylvia. "Yes, and he was murdered at 12." "After 12," said Sylvia. "I heard the policeman on his beat at a quarter past, and then I came down. Poor father was strangled before our very eyes," she said, shuddering. "Hush, dear, don't speak of it," said Paul, rising. "Let us talk of more interesting subjects." "Paul, I can think of nothing till I learn who killed my poor father, and why he was killed so cruelly." "Then we must wait patiently, Sylvia. Hurd is looking after the matter, and I have every confidence in Hurd. And, by Jove," added Beecot, with an afterthought, "Mrs. Krill doubled the reward. Were she concerned in the matter, she would not risk sharpening the wits of so clever a man as Hurd. No, Sylvia, whoever strangled your father, it was not Mrs. Krill." "It was this Indian," insisted Sylvia, "and he's a Thug." Paul laughed, although he was far from thinking she might be wrong. Of course it seemed ridiculous that a Thug should strangle the old man. In the first place, the Thugs had been blotted out. In the second, if any survived, they certainly would not exercise their devilish religion in England. And in the third, Hokar, putting aside his offering strangled victims to Bhowanee, the goddess of the sect, had no reason for slaying an unoffending man. Finally, There was the sailor to be accounted for. The sailor who had tried to get the jewels from Pash. Paul wondered if Hurd had found out anything about this individual. "It's all very difficult," sighed Beecot, "and the more we go into the matter, the more difficult does it get. But we'll see light some day. Hurd, if anyone, will unravel the mystery." And Sylvia agreed with him. End of chapter 16.
Chapter 17 of the Opal Serpent by Fergus Hume. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Hurd's information. For the next day or two Paul was kept closely to work in the office, reading a number of tales which were awaiting his judgment. After hours he several times tried to see Billy Hurd, but was unable to meet him. He left a note at the Scotland Yard office asking if Hurd had received his communication regarding Mrs. Krill, and if so, what he proposed to do concerning it. Hurd did not reply to this note, and Paul was growing puzzled over the silence of the detective. At length the answer came, not in writing, but in the person of Hurd himself, who called on Beecot. The young man had just finished his frugal meal, and was settling down to an evening's work, when there came a knock to the door. Hurd, dressed in his usual brown suit, presented himself, looking cool and composed. But he was more excited than one would imagine, as Paul saw from the expression of his eyes. The detective accepted a cup of coffee and lighted his pipe. Then he sat down in the armchair on the opposite side of the fireplace and prepared to talk. Paul heaped on coals with a lavish hand, little as he could afford this extravagance, as the night was cold, and he guessed that Hurd had much to say. So on the whole they had a very comfortable and interesting conversation. "I suppose you are pleased to see me?" asked Hurd, puffing meditatively at his briar. Paul nodded. "Very glad," he answered. "That is, if you have done anything about Mrs. Krill." "Well," drawled the detective, smiling, "I have been investigating that murder case." "Lady Rachel Sandals?" said Beecot, eagerly. "Is it really murder?" "I think so, though some folks think it's suicide. Curious that you should have stumbled across that young lord," went on Hurd, musingly, "and more curious still that he should have been in the room with Mrs. Krill without recollecting the name. There was a great fuss made about it at the time." "Oh, I can understand Lord George," said Beecot, promptly. "The murder, if it is one, took place before he was born, and as there seems to have been some scandal in the matter, the family hushed it up. This young fellow probably gathered scraps of information from old servants, but from what he said to me in the cab, I think he knows very little." "Quite enough to put me on the track of Lemuel Krill's reason for leaving Christchurch." "Is that the reason?" "Yes. 23 years ago he left Christchurch at the very time Lady Rachel was murdered in his public house. Then he disappeared for a time, and turned up a year later in Gwynne Street with a young wife whom he had married in the meantime." "Sylvia's mother?" "Exactly, and Miss Norman was born a year later. She's nearly 21, isn't she?" "Yes, she will be 21 in 3 months." Hurd nodded gravely. "The time corresponds," said he, "as the crime was committed 23 years back, and Lord George is only 20. I can understand how he knows so little about it. But didn't he connect Mrs. Krill with the man who died in Gwynne Street?" "No. She explained that. The name of Krill appeared only a few times in the papers, and was principally set forth with the portrait in the handbills. I shouldn't think Lord George was the kind of young man to bother about handbills." "All the same, he might have heard talk at his club. Everyone isn't so stupid." "No, but at all events he did not seem to connect Mrs. Krill with the dead man, and even with regard to the death of his aunt, he fancied she might not be the same woman." "What an ass he must be," said Hurd, contemptuously. "I don't think he has much brain," confessed Paul, shrugging his shoulders.
but he asked me if I thought Mrs. Krill was the same as the landlady of the Red Pig. I denied that she was. I don't like telling lies, but in this case I hope the departure from truth will be pardoned." "You did very right," said the detective. "The fewer people know about these matters the better, especially a chatterbox like this young fool." "Do you know him?" "Yes, under the name of Count de la Tour. But I know of him in another way, which I'll reveal later. Hay is still fleecing him?" "He is, but Lord George seems to be growing suspicious of Hay," and Paul related the conversation he had had with the young man. Hurd grunted. "I'm sorry," he said. "I want to catch Hay red-handed, and if Lord George grows too clever, I may not be able to do so." "Well," said Paul, rather impatiently, "never mind about that fellow just now, but tell me what you have discovered." "Oh, a lot of interesting things. When I got your letter, of course, I at once connected the Opal Serpent with Aaron Norman and his change of name with the murder. I knew that Norman came to Gwynne Street over 20 years ago. That came out in the evidence connected with his death. Therefore, putting two and two together, I searched in the newspapers of that period and found what I wanted." "A report of the case?" "Precisely. After that I hunted up the records at Scotland Yard for further details that were not made public. So I got the whole story together, and I am pretty certain that Aaron Norman, or as he was then Lemuel Krill, murdered Lady Rachel for the sake of that precious brooch." "Ah," said Paul, drawing in a breath. "Now I understand why he fainted when he saw it again. No wonder, considering it was connected in his mind with the death of Lady Rachel." "Quite so, and no wonder the man kept looking over his shoulder in the expectation of being tapped on the shoulder by a policeman. I don't wonder also that he locked up the house and kept his one eye on the ground and went to church secretly to pray. What a life he must have led! Upon my soul, bad as the man was, I'm sorry for him." "So am I," said Paul, "and after all he's Sylvia's father." Poor girl, to have a murderer for a father. Beecot turned pale. "I love Sylvia for herself," he said, with an effort, "and if her father had committed 20 murders, I would not let her go. But she must never know." "No," said Hurd, stretching his hand across and giving Paul a friendly grip. "And I knew you'd stick to her. It wouldn't be fair to blame the girl for what her father did before she was born." "We must keep everything from her, Hurd. I'll marry her and take her abroad sooner than she should learn of this previous murder. But how did it happen?" "I'll tell you in a few minutes." Hurd rose and began to pace the narrow limits of the attic. "By the way, do you know that Norman was a secret drinker of brandy?" Paul nodded and told the detective what he had learned from Mrs. Krill. Hurd was much struck with the intelligence. "I see," said he. "What Mrs. Krill says is quite true. Drink does change the ordinary nature into the opposite. Krill sober was a timid rabbit. Krill drunk was a murderer and a thief. Good Lord, and how he drank!" "Oh, how do you know?" "Well," confessed Hurd, nursing his chin, "Posh and I went to search the Gwynne Street house to find, if possible, the story alluded to in the scrap of paper Deborah Junk found. We couldn't drop across anything of that sort, but in Norman's bedroom, which nobody ever entered, we found brandy bottles by the score, under the bed, ranged along the walls, filling cupboards, stowed away in boxes. I had the curiosity to count them. Those we found ran up to 500, and Lord knows how many more he must have got rid of when he found the bottles crowding him inconveniently." "I expect he got drunk every night," said Paul, thinking. "When he locked up Sylvia and Deborah in the upper room, I can understand now why he did so. He could go to the cellar and take possession of the shop key left on the nail by Bart. Then, free from all intrusion, he could drink till reeling. Not that I think he ever did reel," went on Beecot, mindful of what Mrs. Krill had said. "He could stand a lot. I expect the brandy only converted him into a demon." "And a clever business man," said Hurd. "You know Aaron Norman was not clever over the books. Bart sold those. But from all accounts he was a Shylock when dealing, after 7 o'clock, in the pawnbroking way. I understand now. Sober, he was a timid fool. Drunk, he was a bold, clever villain." "My poor Sylvia, what a father," sighed Paul. "But this crime—" "I'll tell you about it. Lemuel Krill and his wife kept the Red Pig at Christchurch, a little public house it is, on the outskirts of the town, frequented by farm labourers and such like. The business was pretty good, but the couple didn't look to making their fortune. Mrs. Krill was a farmer's daughter." "A Buckinghamshire farmer," said Paul. "How do you know?" "Oh, on receiving information. Mrs. Krill told you so. Well, considering the murder of Lady Rachel, she would have done better to hold her tongue, and have commenced life with her dead husband's money under a new name." "She's a clever woman, too," mused Hurd. "I can't understand her being so unnecessarily frank." "Never mind, go on," said Paul, impatiently. Hurd returned to his seat and refilled his pipe. "Well, then," he continued, "Krill got drunk and gave his wife great trouble. Sometimes he thrashed her and blackened her eyes, and he treated their daughter badly too." "How old was the daughter?" "I can't say. Why do you ask?" "I'll tell you later. Go on, please." "Well, then, Mrs. Krill always revenged herself on her husband when he was sober and timid, so the couple were evenly matched. Krill was master when drunk, and his wife mistress when he was sober. A kind of seesaw sort of life they must have led." "Where does Lady Rachel come in?" "What an impatient chap you are," remonstrated Hurd, in a friendly tone. "I'm coming to that now. Lady Rachel quarrelled with her father over some young artist she wanted to marry. He would not allow the lover to come to the Hall, so Lady Rachel said she would kill herself rather than give him up." "And she did," said Paul, thinking of the suicide theory. "There you go again. How am I to tell you all when you interrupt?" "I beg your pardon. I won't do so again." Hurd nodded smilingly and continued. "One night, it was dark and stormy, Lady Rachel had a royal row with her father. Then she ran out of the Hall saying her father would never see her alive again. She may have intended to commit suicide certainly, or she may have intended to join her lover in London. But whatever she intended to do, the rain cooled her. She staggered into Christchurch and fell down insensible at the door of the Red Pig. Mrs. Krill brought her indoors and laid her on a bed." "Did she know who the lady was?" Hurd shook his head. "She said in her evidence that she did not. But living in the neighbourhood, she certainly must have seen Lady Rachel sometimes. Krill was drunk as usual. He had been boozing all day with the skipper of some craft at Southampton. He was good for nothing, so Mrs. Krill did everything. She declares she went to bed at 11, leaving Lady Rachel sleeping." "Did Lady Rachel recover her senses?" "Yes, according to Mrs. Krill, but she refused to say who she was, and merely stated that she would sleep at the Red Pig that night and would go on to London next morning. Mrs. Krill swore that Lady Rachel had no idea of committing suicide. Well, about midnight, Mrs. Krill, who slept in one room with her daughter, was awakened by loud shouts. She sprang to her feet and hurried out. Her daughter came also, as she had been awakened and was terrified. Mrs. Krill found that her husband was raving mad with drink, and smashing the furniture in the room below. The skipper—" "What was the skipper's name?" "Jessop, Jarvey Jessop. Well, he also, rather drunk, was retiring to bed, and stumbled by chance into Lady Rachel's room. He found her quite dead, and shouted for assistance. The poor lady had a silk handkerchief she wore tied tightly around her throat and fastened to the bedpost. When Jessop saw this, he ran out of the inn in dismay. Mrs. Krill descended to give the alarm to her neighbours, but Krill struck her down, and struck his daughter also, making her mouth bleed. An opal brooch that Lady Rachel wore was missing, but Mrs. Krill only knew of that the next day. She was insensible from the blow given by Krill, and the daughter ran out to get assistance. When the neighbors entered, Krill was gone, and notwithstanding all the search made for him, he could not be found. And Jessop? He turned up and explained that he had been frightened on finding the woman dead. But the police found him on his craft at Southampton, and he gave evidence. He said that Krill, when drunk, was like a demon, as Mrs. Krill told you, had left the room several times. The last time he came back, he and the skipper had a final drink, and then Jessop retired to find the body. It was supposed by the police that Krill had killed Lady Rachel for the sake of the brooch, which could not be discovered. But the brooch. Hold on. I know what you were about to say. We'll come to that shortly. Let me finish this yarn first. It was also argued that, from Lady Rachel's last words to her father, and from the position of the body, tied by the neck to the bedpost, that she had committed suicide. Mrs. Krill, as I said, declared the deceased lady never mentioned the idea of making away with herself. However, Krill's flight, and the chance that, being drunk, he might have strangled the lady for the sake of the brooch while out of the room, made many think he was the culprit, especially as Jessop said that Krill had noticed the brooch and commented on the opals. He was a traveller in jewels once, according to his wife. Yes, and left that to turn innkeeper. Afterwards he vanished, as I say, and became a pawnbroker in Gwynn Street. Well, the jury at the inquest could not agree. Some thought Lady Rachel had committed suicide, and others that Krill had murdered her. Then the family didn't want a scandal, so in one way or another the matter was hushed up. The jury brought in a verdict of suicide by a majority of 1. So you can see how equally they were divided. Lady Rachel's body was laid in the family vault, and nothing more was heard of Lemuel Krill. What did Mrs. Krill do? She stopped on at the inn, as she told you. People were sorry for her and helped her, so she did very well. Mother and daughter have lived at the Red Pig all these years, highly respected, until they saw the handbills about Krill. Then the money was claimed. But as the circumstances of Lady Rachel's fate was so old, nobody thought of mentioning it till this young lord did so to you. And I, as you see, have hunted out the details. "What is your opinion, Hurd?" asked Paul, deeply interested. "Oh, I think Krill murdered the woman, and then cut to London. That accounts for his looking over his shoulder, etc., about which we talked." "But how did he get the money to start as a bookseller? Premises are not leased in Gwynn Street for nothing." "Well, he might have got money on the brooch." "No, the brooch was pawned by a nautical gentleman." Paul started up. "Captain Jessop, perhaps. You remember," he said excitedly. "Ah," said Hurd, puffing his pipe with satisfaction. "I see you understand. I mentioned that about the brooch to hear what you would say. Yes, Jessop must have pawned the brooch at Stowley, and it must have been Jessop who came with the note for the jewels to Pash." "Ah," said Paul, walking excitedly about the room. "Then it would seem that Jessop and Krill were in league." "I think so," said Hurd, staring at the fire, "and yet I am not sure. Jessop may have found that Krill had killed the woman, and then have made him give up the brooch, which he afterwards pawned at Stowley. Though why he should go near Mrs. Krill's old home, I can't understand." "Is Stowley near her old home?" "Yes, in Buckinghamshire. However, after pawning the brooch, I expect Jessop lost sight of Krill till he must have come across him a few days before the crime. Then he must have made Krill sign the paper ordering the jewels to be given up by Pash, so that he might get money. A kind of blackmail, in fact. Well," said Hurd doubtfully, "after all, Jessop might have killed Krill himself." "But how did Jessop get the brooch?" "Ah, that I can't tell you, unless Norman himself picked it up in the street. We must find these things out. I'm going to Christchurch to make inquiries. I'll let you know what I discovered." And Hurd rose. "1 minute," said Paul, hastily. "Do you think Miss Krill is the dead man's child?" "Of course. She's as like her mother as 2 peas. Why do you ask?" Paul detailed what Sylvia and Deborah had said. "So if she is over 30," said Beecot, "she can't be Krill's child, or else she must have been born before Krill married his wife. In either case she has no right to the money." "It's strange," said Hurd, musingly. "I'll have to look into that. Meanwhile I've got plenty to do. There's another thing I have to say." "You'll confuse me, Beecot. What is it?" "The sugar and that hawker," and Paul related what Sylvia had said about Thuggism. Hurd sat down and stared. "That must be bosh," he said, looking at the novel, "and yet it's mighty queer. I say," he took the 3 volumes, "will you lend me these?" "Yes, be careful, they are not mine." "I'll be careful, but I can't dip into them just yet, nor can I go into that Hindoo business, let alone this age of Miss Krill. The first thing I have to do is to go to Christchurch and see if Mrs. Krill was at home on the night of the 6th of July." Hurd started. "Oh," he said dryly, "the night the crime was committed, you mean. Well, I didn't intend to look up that point, as I do not see how Mrs. Krill can be implicated. However, I'll take a note of that," and this he did, and then continued, "but I'm anxious to find Jessop. I shouldn't be at all surprised to learn that he committed the double crime." "The double crime?" "Yes, he might have strangled Lady Rachel, and 20 years later have killed Krill. I can't be sure, but I think he is the guilty person." Chapter 17.
Chapter 18 of the Opal Serpent by Fergus Hume. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. At Christchurch, Hants. The next afternoon, Hurd was on his way to the former abode of Mrs. Krill. During the journey he glanced at his notes and arranged what inquiries he should make. It struck him as strange that Mrs. Krill should have told Paul of her association with the Red Pig, considering the reputation of the place, in connection with Lady Rachel Sandal's murder or suicide. It would have been better had Mrs. Krill changed her name by letters patent and have started a new life on her dead husband's money. The detective could not understand the reason for this unnecessary frankness. Before leaving town, he took the precaution to call on Posh, and note down a description of the sailor, presumably Jessop, who had tried to obtain possession of the jewels on the morning after the crime had been committed in Gwynn Street. He learned that the man, who had given no name, was tall and stout, with the flushed skin of a habitual drinker of strong waters, and reddish hair mixed with gray. He also had a scar running from his right temple to his mouth, although this was partly concealed by a beard, yet it was distinctly visible. The man was dressed in blue serge, carried his large hand slightly clenched, and rolled in his gait. Hurd noted these things down, and had little doubt but what he would recognize the man if he came across him. Connecting him with the individual who had pawned the brooch at Stowley, Hurd fancied he might be Jessop. He resolved to look for him in Southampton, as, judging from the evidence given at the inquest on Lady Rachel's remains, that was the port of call for the mariner. At the station immediately before that of Christchurch, Hurd glanced at a telegram which he produced out of his pocket book, and then leaned out of the carriage window. A pretty, daintily dressed little woman saw him, and at once entered the carriage with a gay laugh. She was Miss Aurora Quian, and Paul would have been considerably astonished had he overheard her conversation with Mr. Hurd. But the detective and the actress had the compartment to themselves and talked freely. "It's the safest place to talk in," explained Mrs. Quian, producing a bag of chocolate and eating during the conversation.
Of course I told the landlady at the Red Pig that my brother was coming down, so we can go there right enough. But the walls have ears. I don't think railway carriages have, though, and we have much to say, Billy." "Have you found out anything, Aurora?" asked Hurd. Miss Qian nodded. "A great deal, considering I have been in the place only 24 hours. It's a good thing I'm out of an engagement, Billy, or I shouldn't have time to leave London or to look after that man Hay. I am a good sister." "Well, you are, but there's money in the business also. If I can get that £1,000, you'll have your share." "I know you'll treat me straight, Billy," said the actress, with much satisfaction. "I always say that my brother is as square a man as I know." "The deuce you do," said Hurd, rather vexed. "I hope you don't go telling every one that I'm your brother, Aurora." "Only one or two special friends. Not Hay, you may be sure. Nor does that nice Mr. Beecot know that we are brother and sister." "You best keep it dark and say nothing, Aurora. It's just as well you left the private detective business and went on the stage. You talk too much." "Oh, no, I don't," retorted Miss Qian, eating a sweet. "Don't be nasty, Billy, or I'll tell you nothing." Her brother shrugged his shoulders. He was very fond of Aurora, but he saw her many faults, and she certainly had too long a tongue for one engaged in private matters. "What about Hay?" he asked. Aurora raised her eyes. "I thought you wanted to know of my discoveries at Christchurch," she said, pouting. "Well, I do, but Hay—" "Oh, he's all right. He's going to marry Miss Krill and her money, and is getting cash together by fleecing young Sandal. That fool will play and keeps losing his money, although I've warned him." "Then don't warn him. I wish to catch Hay red-handed." "Ah," Miss Qian nodded. "You may catch him red-handed in a worse matter than gambling." "Aurora, you don't mean to say he has anything to do with the murder of Aaron Norman?" "Well, I don't want to go so far as to say that, Billy. But when I got settled in the private sitting room of the Red Pig, on the plea that I had come down for a change of air, and expected my brother—" "Which you do without any lies." "Yes, that's all right, Billy," she said impatiently. "Well, the first thing I clapped eyes on was a portrait of Grexon Hay in a silver frame on the mantelpiece." Said Hurd, nursing his chin in his hand. "He may have given that to Miss Krill during the engagement." "I dare say," rejoined the actress tartly, "for he has been engaged for many a long day, say 2 years." "I thought so," said Hurd triumphantly. "I always fancied the meeting at Pash's office was a got-up thing." "What made you think so?" "Because, when disguised as Count de la Tour, I overheard Hay address Miss Krill as Maud, and it was the first time she and her mother came to his rooms. Sandal was there, and gambling went on as usual. I lost money myself," said Hurd, with a grimace, "in order to make Hay think I was another pigeon to pluck. But the mention of the Christian name on so short an acquaintance showed me that Hay and Miss Krill had met before. I expect the meeting at Pash's office was a got-up game." "You said that before, Billy. How you repeat yourself. Yes, there's an inscription on the portrait, 'From Grexon to Maud, with much love.' Sweet, isn't it, when you think what an icicle the man is? There's also a date, 2 years ago the photograph was given. I admired the photograph and asked the landlady who was the swell." "What's the landlady's name?" "Matilda Junk." Hurd almost jumped from his seat. "That's queer," he said. "The woman who is devoted to Miss Norman, and who nursed her since she was a baby, is called Deborah Junk." "I know that," said Aurora. "I'm not quite a fool, Billy. I mentioned Deborah Junk, whom I saw at the inquest on Norman's body. The landlady said she was her sister, but she had not heard of her for ages. And this Matilda is just like Deborah in looks, a large Dutch doll with beady eyes and a badly painted face." "Well, that's a point," said Hurd, making a note. "What did she say about the photograph?" "Oh, that it was one of Mr. Hay, who was Miss Krill's young man, and that they had been engaged for 2 years. Matilda seems to be a chatterbox. She is. I got a lot out of her. Then there can be nothing to conceal on the part of Mrs. Krill. Well, said Aurora, throwing the empty sweetmeat bag out of the window and brushing her lap. So far as I can discover, Mrs. Krill is a perfectly respectable person, and has lived for 30 years as the landlady of the Red Pig. Matilda acknowledged that her mistress had inherited the money of Lemuel Krill, and Matilda knows all about the murder. Matilda is wrong, said the detective dryly. Miss Krill gets the money. Aurora smiled. From what I heard, Miss Krill has to do what her mother tells her. She's nobody, and her mother is all the world. Matilda confessed that her mistress had behaved very well to her. When the money came, she gave up the Red Pig to Matilda Junk, who is now the landlady. With a proviso she should hold her tongue? No, Mrs. Krill, so far as I can learn, has nothing to conceal. Even if it becomes known in London that she was a landlady of a small pub, I don't think it will matter. Did you ask questions about Lady Rachel's murder? No, you gave me only a hint when you sent me down. I didn't like to venture on the ground I wasn't sure of. I'm more cautious than you. Well, I'll tell you everything now, said Hurd, and gave a rapid sketch of what he had learned from the newspapers and the Scotland Yard papers relative to the Sandal affair. Aurora nodded. But Matilda Junk said nothing of that. She merely stated that Mr. Lemuel Krill had gone to London over 20 years ago, and that his wife knew nothing of him until she saw the handbills. Said Hurd again, as the train slowed down to the Christchurch station. It seems all fair and above board. What about Jessop? Knowing so little of the Lady Rachel case, I didn't inquire about him, said Aurora. I've told you everything. Anyone else stopping at the inn? No, and it's not a bad little place after all. The rooms are clean, and the food's good, and the charges low. I'd rather stop at the Red Pig, small as it is, than a big hotel. The curries, oh, they are delightfully hot. Miss Qian screwed her small face into a smile of ecstasy. But then a native makes them. Hurd started. Curries? A native? Yes, a man called Hokar. Aurora, that's the man who left the sugar on the counter of Norman's shop. I forgot, you don't know about that, and Hurd rapidly told her of the episode. It's strange, said Miss Qian, nodding with a faraway look. It would seem that Mrs. Krill knew of the whereabouts of her husband before she saw the handbills. And possibly about the murder also, said Hurd. Brother and sister looked at one another. The case was becoming more and more interesting. Mrs. Krill evidently knew more than she chose to admit. But at this moment the train stopped and they got out. Hurd took his handbag and walked into the town with his pretty sister tripping beside him. She gave him an additional piece of information before they arrived at the Red Pig. This Hokar is not at all popular, she said. They say he eats cats and dogs. Yes, I've talked to several old women, and they say they lost their animals. One cat was found strangled in the yard, and Strangled, interrupted the detective. And the man's an Indian, possibly a thug. What's a thug? Asked Aurora, staring. Hurd explained. I ran through the book lent by Beecot last night, he added, and was so interested I sat up till dawn. You do look chippy, said his sister candidly, but from what you say, there are no thugs living. No, the author said so. Still, it's queer, this strangling and the cruel way in which the man was murdered. Just what a Hindu would do. The sugar, too. Oh, nonsense. Hokar left the sugar by mistake. If he had intended to murder Norman, he wouldn't have given himself away. I expect he never thought anyone would guess he was a thug. The novel is not one usually read nowadays. It was the merest chance that Miss Norman came across it and told Beecot." "I don't believe in such coincidences," said Aurora, dryly, for in spite of her fluffy, kittenish looks, she was a very practical person. "But here we are at the Red Pig. Nice and comfy, isn't it?" The inn was certainly very pretty. It stood on the very verge of the town, and beyond stretched fields and hedgerows. The house itself was a whitewashed, thatched, rustic cottage, with a badly painted sign of a large red sow. Outside were benches where toppers sat, and the windows were delightfully old-fashioned, diamond-paned casements. Quite a Dickens inn of the old coaching days was the Red Pig. But Hurd gave the pretty, quaint hostel only a passing glance. He was staring at a woman who stood in the doorway, shading her eyes with the palm of her hand from the setting sun. In her the detective saw the image of Deborah Junk, now Tawsey. She was of the same gigantic build, with the same ruddy face, sharp, black eyes, and a boisterous manner. But she had not the kindly look of Deborah, and of the two sisters, Hurd preferred the one he already knew. "This is my brother, Miss Junk," said Aurora, marching up to the door. "He will only stay until tomorrow." "You're welcome, sir," said Matilda in a loud and hearty voice, which reminded the detective more than ever of her sister. "Will you please walk in and have some tea?" Hurd nodded, and repaired to the tiny sitting room, where he saw the photograph of Hay on the mantelpiece. Aurora, at a hint from her brother, went to her bedroom to change her dress, and Hurd spoke to Matilda when she brought in the tray. "I know your sister," said he. Miss Junk nearly dropped the tray. "Lord, now, only think. Why, we ain't wrote to one another for 10 years, and I left London 11 years back. And how is she, sir, and where is she?" "She is well. She has a laundry in Jubilee Town, near London, and she is married to a fellow called Bert Tawsey." "Married!" cried Matilda, setting down the tray and putting her arms akimbo, just like Deborah. "Lord, and me still single. But now I've got this house, and a bit put by, I'll think of getting a husband. I ain't going to let Debby crow over me." "Your sister was in the service of Mr. Norman before she took up the laundry," observed Hurd, pouring out a cup of tea. "Was she now? And why did she leave?" The name of Norman apparently was unknown to Matilda, so Hurd tried to effect another bombshell. "Her master was murdered under the name of Lemuel Krill." "Mercy!" Matilda dropped into a chair with a thud which shook the room. "Why, that's my lady's husband and father." "What ladies?" asked Hurd, pretending ignorance. "My ladies, Mrs. Krill and Miss Maud. They had this house, and kept it for years respectable. I worked for 'em 10, and when my ladies come in for a fortune there is, they gave me the good will of the Red Pig. To think of Debby being the servant of poor Mr. Krill as was killed. Who killed him?" "Doesn't your mistress know?" "She!" cried Matilda indignantly, and bouncing up. "Why, she was always a looking for him, not as she loved him over much. As he is dead, sir, it is no more as what he ought to be, seeing as he killed a poor lady in this very house." "You'll sleep in her room to night," added Matilda, as if that was a pleasure. "Strangled she was." "I think I heard of that. But Lady Rachel Sandal committed suicide." Matilda rubbed her nose after the Deborah fashion. "Well, sir, my ladies were never sure which it was, and of course it was before my time considerable, being more nor 20 years back. But the man as did it is dead, and left my ladies as money as he oughter. And Miss Maud a going to marry a real gent." Matilda glanced at the photograph. "I always said he was a gent, being so haughty like, and wearing evening dress at meals late. Was he ever down here, this gentleman? He's been coming and going for months, and Miss Maud loves him something cruel. But they'll marry now and be happy." I suppose your ladies sometimes went to see this gent in town?" "Meaning Mr. Hay," said Matilda, artlessly. "Well, sir, they did, one at a time, and then together. Missus would go and Miss would follow, and Missus together would take their joy of the Towers and shops and Madame Tussaud's and such like, Mr. Hay always looking after 'em." "Did they ever visit Mr. Hay in July?" "No, they didn't," snapped Matilda, with a change of tone which did not escape Hurd. "And I don't know, sir, why you ask them questions." "My good woman, I ask no questions. If I do, you need not reply. Let us change the subject. My sister tells me you make good curries in this hotel." "Hokar do, me being but a plain cook." "Oh, he's an Indian?" "Yes, he is, sir. A poor Indian castaway as missus took up with when he come here drenched with rain and weary. Ah, missus was always good and kind and Christian like." Privately Hurd thought this description did not apply very well to the lady in question, but he was careful not to arouse Matilda's suspicions again by contradicting her. He pretended to joke. "I wonder you wouldn't marry this Indian, and keep him here always to make the curries I've heard of." "Me marry a black?" cried Matilda, tossing her rough head. "Well, sir, I never!" And her breath failed her. "And him going about the country." "What do you mean by that?" "What I say," said Miss Junk. "He'll stop here, Christian like, for days, and then go off to sell things as a hawker. My pa was a hawker, sir, but a white man of the finest." Hurd was about to ask another question when a husky voice was heard singing somewhat out of tune. "What's that?" asked Hurd, irritably. "Lord, sir, what nerves you have! 'Tis only Captain Jessop making himself happy like." "Captain Jessop?" Hurd laughed. He had run down his man at last. Chapter 19. Of the Opal Serpent by Fergus Hume. This recording is in the public domain. Captain Jessop. Apparently Matilda Junk was quite ignorant of anything being wrong about her ladies, although she did shirk the question regarding their possible visit to London in July. However, Hurd had learned that Grexon Hay was not only an old friend, but had been engaged to Maud for many months. This information made him the more certain that Hay had robbed Beecot of the opal brooch at the time of the accident, and that it had passed from Mr. Hay's hands into those of the assassin. "I wonder if Mrs. Krill murdered her husband in that cruel way," thought the detective, sitting over his tea. "But what could have been her object? She could have gone up on learning from Hay that Aaron Norman was her husband, as I believe she did, and could then have made him give her the money, by threatening him with the murder of Lady Rachel. I dare say Aaron Norman, in his Krill days, did strangle that lady to get the opal brooch, and his wife could have used what she knew to govern him. There was no need of murder. I'll see about getting the truth out of Hay. Aurora," he cried. "Oh, there you are," he added, as she entered the room. "I want you to go back to town this night." "What for, Billy?" "Can you get Hay into trouble?" Aurora nodded. "I have proofs of his cheating Lord George and others, if that's what you mean," she said. "But you didn't want them used." "Nor do I. He is such an eel, he may wriggle out of our clutches. But can't you give a party and invite Lord George and Hay, and then get them to play cards? Should Hay cheat, denounce him to George Sandal." "What good would that do?" asked Miss Qian, with widely open eyes. "It will make Hay confess about the brooch to save himself from public shame. His reputation is his life, remember, and if he is caught red-handed cheating, he'll have to clear out of town." "Pooh, as if that mattered. He's going to marry Miss Krill. If Miss Krill keeps the money and I doubt if she will." "But Billy—" "Never mind. Don't ask me any more questions, but go and pack. This Captain Jessop is in the bar drinking. I may probably have to arrest him. I got a warrant on the chance of finding him here. I can arrest him on suspicion, and won't let him go until I get at the truth. Your business is to bring Hay to his knees and get the truth out of him about the Opal Serpent. You know the case." "Yes," grumbled Aurora, "I know the case, but I don't like this long journey tonight." "Every moment is precious. If I arrest Jessop, Matilda Junk will tell her ladies, who will speak to Hay, and then he may slip away. As the brooch evidence is so particular, and as I believe he can give it, if forced, you can see the importance of losing no time." Miss Qian nodded and went away to pack. She wanted money, and knew Billy would give her a goodly share of the reward. In a few minutes Miss Junk, of the Red Pig, learned that Miss Qian was suddenly summoned to town, and would leave in an hour. Quite unsuspectingly, she assisted her to pack, and shortly Aurora was driving in a hired vehicle to the railway station on her way to trap Grexon Hay. When she was safely off the premises, Hurd walked to the telegraph office and sent a cipher message to the Yard, asking for a couple of plainclothes policemen to be sent down. He wanted to have Hokar and Miss Matilda Junk watched, also the house, in case Mrs. Krill and her daughter should return. Captain Jessop he proposed to look after himself, but he was in no hurry to make that gentleman's acquaintance, as he intended to arrest him quietly in the sitting room after dinner. Already he had informed Matilda that he would ask a gentleman to join him at the meal and taste Hokar's curry. The thought of the curry brought the Indian to his mind, and when he got back to the Red Pig, he strolled round the house, inspecting the place, but in reality keeping eyes and ears open to talk to the Hindoo. Thinking he might meet the man some time, Hurd had carefully learned a few phrases relating to Thuggism, in English of course, since he knew nothing of the Indian tongues. These he proposed to use in the course of conversation with Hokar, and watch the effect. Soon he found the man sitting cross-legged under a tree in the yard smoking. Evidently his work for the day was over, and he was enjoying himself. Remembering the description given by Bart, the detective saw that this was the very man who had entered the shop of Aaron Norman. He wore the same dress and looked dirty and disreputable, quite a waif and a stray. "Hello," said Hurd casually. "What are you doing? Talk English, eh?" "Yes, sir," said Hokar calmly. "I spike good Inglis. Missionary teach Hokar Inglis." "I'm glad of that. We can have a chat," said Hurd, producing his pipe. He also produced something else, with which he had provided himself on the way back from the post office. In another minute Hokar was staring at a small parcel of coarse brown sugar. With all his oriental phlegm, the man could not keep his countenance. His eyes rolled until they threatened to drop out of his head, and he looked at Hurd with a certain amount of fear. "Gore," said that gentleman, pointing to the sugar with the stem of his pipe. "Gore." Hokar turned green under his dark skin, and half rose to go away, but his legs failed him, and he sat still, trying to recover himself. "So you worship Bhowanee," went on his tormentor. The Indian's face expressed lively curiosity. "The great goddess." "Yes, Kalee. You know. Did you make Tupounee after you used your roomal on Aaron Norman?" Hokar gave a guttural cry and gasped. Tupounee is a sacrifice made by the Thugs after a successful crime, and roomal the handkerchief with which they strangle their victims. All this was information culled from Colonel Meadow Taylor's book by the accomplished detective. "Well," said Hurd, smoking placidly, "what have you to say, Mr. Hokar?" "I know nothing," said the man, sullenly, but in deadly fear. "Yes, you do. Sit still," said Hurd, with sudden sternness. "If you try to run away I'll have you arrested. Eyes are on you, and you can't take a step without my knowing." Some of this was Greek to the Indian, owing to his imperfect knowledge of English, but he understood that the law would lay hold of him if he did not obey the sahib, and so sat still. "I know not anything," he repeated, his teeth chattering. "Yes, you do. You're a thug." "Is there no thugs?" "I agree with you," said Hurd. "You are the last of the Mohegans. I want to know why you offered Aaron Norman to Bhowanee." Hokar made a strange sign on his forehead at the mention of the sacred name, and muttered something, perhaps a prayer, in his native tongue. Then he looked up. "I know nothing." "Don't repeat that rubbish," said Hurd, calmly. "You sold bootlaces in the shop in Gwynne Street on the day when its master was killed, and he was the husband of the lady who helped you, Mrs. Krill." "You say dat," said Hokar, stolidly. "Yes, and I can prove it. The boy Tray, and I can lay my hands on him, saw you, also Bert Tawsey, the shopman. You left a handful of sugar, though why you did so instead of eating it I can't understand." Hokar's face lighted up, and he showed his teeth disdainfully. "Oh, you sahibs know nothing," said he, spreading out his lean brown hands. "The shop, as yes, I there is. But I no use roomal." "Not then, but you did later." Hokar shook his head. "I use no roomal. Sat sahib one eye. Bad, very bad. Bhowanee no have one eye. No Bhungees, no Bats, no—" "What are you talking about?" said Hurd, angrily. His reading had not told him that no maimed person could be offered to the goddess of the Thugs. Bhunge meant sweepers, and Bhats bards, both of which classes were spared by the Stranglers. "You killed that man. Now, who told you to kill him?" "I know nossing. I no kill. Bhowanee no take one-eyed mans." For want of an interpreter, Hurd found it difficult to carry on the conversation. He rose and determined to postpone further examination till he would get someone who understood the Hindu tongue. But in the meantime Hokar might run away, and Hurd rather regretted that he had been so precipitate. However, he nodded to the man and went off, pretty sure he would not fly at once. Then Hurd went to the village police office and told a bucolic constable to keep his eye on Miss Junk's foreigner, as he learned Hokar was called. The policeman, a smooth-faced individual, promised to do so after Hurd produced his credentials and sauntered towards the Red Pig at some distance from the detective's heels. A timely question about the curry revealed, by the mouth of Miss Junk, that Hokar was still in the kitchen. "But he do seem alarmed like," said Matilda, laying the cloth. "Let's hope he won't spoil the curry," remarked Hurd. Then, knowing Hokar was safe, he went into the bar to make the acquaintance of his other victim. Captain Jarvey Jessop quite answered to the description given by Pash. He was large and sailor-like, with red hair mixed with gray, and a red beard that scarcely concealed the scar running from temple to mouth. He had drunk enough to make him cheerful, and was quite willing to fall into conversation with Hurd, who explained himself unnecessarily. "I'm a commercial agent," said the detective, "calling for 2 rums, plain, and I like talking." "Me too," growled the sailor, grasping his glass. "I'm here on what you'd call a visit, but I go back to my home tomorrow. Then it's ho for Callao," he shouted in a sing-song voice. Hurd knew the fierce old chanty, and sized Captain Jarvey up at once. He was of the buccaneer type, and there was little he would not do to make money and have a roaring time. Failing Hokar with his deadly handkerchief, here was the man who might have killed Aaron Norman. "Drink up," shouted Hurd in his turn. "We'll have some more." "Oh, no condition is extradition allowed in Callao." "Gum," said Captain Jessop. "You know the chanty." Hurd winked. "I've been round about in my time." Jessop stretched out a huge hand. "Put it there, mate," said he, with a roar like a foghorn, "and drink up along with me. My treat." Hurd nodded and became jovial. "On condition you join me at dinner. They make good curries here." "I've had curry," said Captain Jessop, heavily, "in Colombo and Hong Kong frequent. But Hokar's curries are the best." "Ah," said Hurd, in a friendly, curious way. "So you know this shanty?" Jessop looked at him with contempt. "Know this shanty?" said he, with a grin. "Why, in course I do. I've been swinging my hammock here, time in and out, for the last 30 years." "You be a Christchurch man, then?" "Not me, mate. I'm Buckinghamshire. Stowley born." Hurd with difficulty suppressed a start. Stowley was the place where the all important brooch had been pawned by a nautical man, and here was the man in question. "I should have thought you lived near the sea," he said cautiously. "Say Southampton." "Oh, I used to go there for my ship," said the captain, draining his glass, "but I don't go there no more." "Retired, eh?" Jessop nodded and looked at his friend, as he considered Hurd, since the invitation to dinner, with a bloodshot pair of eyes. "Come storm, come calm," he growled, "I've sailed the ocean for 40 years. Yes, sir, you bet. I was a slip of a 15 cabin boy on my first cruise, and then I got on to being skipper. Lord," Jessop smacked his knee, "the things I've seen." "We'll have them tonight after dinner," said Hurd, nodding. "But now I suppose you've made your fortune." "No," said the captain, gloomily, "not what you'd call money. I've got a standby, though," and he winked. "Ah, married to a rich wife?" "Not me. I've had enough of marriage, having been the skipper of a mermaid with a tongue. No, sir," he roared out another line of some song floating in his muzzy head. "A saucy bachelor am I," then changed to gruff talk, "and I intends being one all my days. Stand by I have. 'Tain't a wife, but I can draw the money regular and no questions asked." Again he winked and drank another glass. Hurd reflected that perhaps Jessop had killed Aaron Norman for Mrs. Krill, and she was paying him blood money. But he did not dare to press the question, as Jessop was coming perilously near what the Irish call the cross drop. He therefore proposed an adjournment to the sitting room. Jessop agreed quite unsuspectingly, not guessing he was being trapped. The man was so large and uncouth that Hurd felt behind his waist to see that his revolver was loose and could be used should the occasion arise. Miss Junk brought in the dinner with her own fair hands, and explained that Hokar had made the curry, but she didn't think it was as good as usual. "The man's shaking like a jelly," said Matilda. "I don't know why." The detective nodded, but did not encourage conversation. He was quite sure that Hokar was being watched by the smooth-faced policeman, and could not get away. Besides, he wished to talk to Captain Jessop. Miss Junk, seeing that she was not needed, retreated after bringing in the curry, and left the gentlemen to help themselves. So here was Hurd in a pleasant room, seated before a well spread table, with a roaring fire at his back, waiting his opportunity to make Captain Jarvey Jessop confess his share in the dual murders of Lady Rachel Sandal and Aaron Norman. End of chapter 19.
Chapter 20 of the Opal Serpent by Fergus Hume. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part of the truth. Captain Jessop ate as greedily as he drank strong waters, and did full justice to the curry, which was really excellent. Hurd did not broach any unpleasant topic immediately, as he wished the man to enjoy his meal. If Jessop was guilty, this dainty dinner would be the last of its kind he would have for many a long day. Moreover, Hurd wished to learn more of the mariner's character, and plied him with questions which the unsuspecting sailor answered amiably enough. "Me and you might become mates, as it were," said Jessop, extending his large hand again and again. "Put it there." "Well, we'd want to know something more about one another to become real mates," laughed Hurd. "Oh, you're a commercial traveller, as you say, and I'm the captain of as fine a barkie as ever sailed under Capricorn. Leastways, I was, before I gave up deep sea voyages." "You must miss the ocean, living in Stowley." "Inland it is," admitted the mariner, pulling out a dirty clay pipe, at the conclusion of the meal, "and ocean there ain't round 'bout for miles. And I've got a shanty there, but live respectable." "You are able to, with the stand by?" hinted Hurd. Jessop nodded, and crammed black tobacco, very strong and rank, into the bowl of his pipe with a shaking hand. "It ain't much," he admitted, "folks being stingy, but if I wants more," he struck the table hard, "I can get it. Do you see, Mr. Commercial?" "Yes, I see," replied Hurd, coolly. Jessop was again growing cross, and the detective had to be careful. He knew well enough that the next morning, when sober, Jessop would not be so disposed to talk. But, being muzzy, he opened his heart freely. Still, it was evident that a trifle more liquor would make him quarrelsome. So Hurd proposed coffee, a proposition to which the sailor graciously assented. "Coffee," he observed, lighting his pipe and filling the room with evil smelling smoke, "clears the head. Not as mine wants clearing, mind you, but coffee ain't bad when rum ain't to be had." "You'll have more rum later," hinted Hurd. "Put it there," said Jessop, and again the detective was forced to wince at the strong grip of a horny hand. Miss Junk appeared in answer to the tinkle of the bell and removed the food. Afterwards she brought in coffee, hot and strong and black, and Jessop drank 2 cups, with the result that he became quieter. Then the two men settled down for a pleasant conversation. At least Jessop thought so, for he frequently expressed the friendliest sentiments towards his host. Then Matilda appeared with a bottle of rum, a kettle, and 2 glasses. When she departed, Hurd intimated that he would not require her services again that night. This he whispered to her at the door, while Jessop was placing the kettle on the fire, and before returning to his seat he quietly turned the key. So he had the mariner entirely to himself, and got to business at once while the kettle boiled. "You have known this place for years, I believe," said Hurd, taking a chair opposite that of Jessop. "Did you ever drop across a man who used to live here, called Lemuel Krill?" The other man started. "Whatever makes you ask that?" he inquired in a husky voice. "Well, you see, as a commercial, I trade in books, and had to do with a second hand bookseller in Gwynne Street, Drury Lane. It seems that he was murdered," and he eyed Jessop attentively. The sailor nodded and composed himself with a violent effort. "Yes," said he in his husky voice, "so I heard. But what's he got to do with Lemuel Krill?" "Oh," said Hurd carelessly, "it is said Aaron Norman was Krill." "Might have been. I don't know myself," was the gruff reply. "Ah, then you did not know Lemuel Krill?" "Well," admitted the captain reluctantly, "I did. He was the landlord of this here pub, and a cuss to drink. Lord, how he could drink, and did so. But he run away from his wife as used to keep this shanty, and she never heard no more of him." "Until she found he was rich, and could leave her 5,000 a year," said Hurd absently. "So like a woman." "You seem to know all about it, mister," said the sailor uneasily. "Yes, I read the papers. A queer case that of Norman's death. I expect it was only right he should be strangled, seeing he killed Lady Rachel Sandal in the same way." Jessop, resting his hands on the arms of his chair, pushed it back and stared with a white face. "You know of that?" he gasped. "Why not? It was public talk in this place over 20 years ago. I understand you have been hereabouts for 30 years," went on Hurd, carelessly. "Possibly you may recollect the case." Jessop wiped his forehead.
I heard something about it. That there was a lady committed suicide, they say." "I know what they say, but I want to know what you say." "I won't be asked questions," shouted the captain, angrily. "Don't raise your voice," said the detective, smoothly. "We may as well conduct this conversation pleasantly." "I don't converse no more," said Jessop, in a shaky voice, and staggered to his feet, rapidly growing sober under the influence of a deadly fear. Hurd did not move as the man crossed the room, but felt if the key was safe in his pocket. The sailor tried to open the door, and then realized that it was locked. He turned on his host with a volley of bad language, and found himself facing a levelled revolver. "Sit down," said Hurd, quietly. "Go back to your chair." Jessop, with staring eyes and outspread hands, backed to the wall. "Who are you, anyhow?" he demanded, hardly able to speak. "Perhaps that will tell you," said Hurd, and threw the warrant on the table. Jessop staggered forward and looked at it. One glance was sufficient to inform him what it was, and he sank back into his chair with a groan, leaving the warrant on the table. Hurd picked it up and slipped it into his pocket. He thought Jessop might destroy it, but there was no fight in the mariner. "And now that we understand one another," said Hurd, putting away his weapon, "I want to talk." "Shan't talk," said Jessop, savagely. "Oh, yes, I think so. Otherwise I can make things unpleasant for you." "You can't arrest me. I've done nothing." "That may be so, but arrest you I can, and I have done so now. To morrow you will go to London in charge of a plainclothes policeman, while I go to Stowley." "To my crib? No, I'm blessed if you do." "I shan't go immediately to your crib," rejoined Hurd, dryly, "though I may do so later. My first visit will be to that old pawnbroker. I think if I describe you, and you are rather a noticeable man, Captain Jessop, he will recognize the individual who pawned an Opal Serpent brooch with him shortly after the death of Lady Rachel Sandal, to whom the said brooch belonged." "It's a lie," said Jessop, hoarsely, and sober enough now. "Quite so, and perhaps it is also a lie that a man resembling yourself tried to get certain jewellery from a lawyer called Pash." Jessop lost his self-control, which he was trying desperately to preserve, and rose to his feet, white-faced and haggard. "Who are you?" he shouted. "Who are you?" "Doesn't the warrant tell you?" replied his companion, not at all upset. "My name is Billy Hurd. I am the detective in charge of the Norman murder case, and I've been looking for you for a long time, Mr. Jessop." "I know nothing about it." "Yes, you do. So sit down and talk away." "I'll break your head," cried the captain, swinging his huge fist. "Try." Hurd whipped out his revolver, but did not rise. "At the risk of getting a bullet through you?" "Pshaw, man, don't be a fool. I'm making things as easy for you as possible. Create a disturbance and I'll hand you over to the police. A night in the village lockup may cool your blood. Sit down, I tell you." The sailor showed his teeth like those of a snarling dog, and made as if to strike the seated detective, but suddenly changing his mind, for he saw well enough in what danger he stood, he dropped into his chair, and, covering his face with his hands, groaned aloud. Hurd put away his revolver. "That's better," he said, pleasantly. "Take a tote of rum and tell me all you know." "I'm innocent," groaned Jessop. "Every man is innocent until convicted by a jury," said Hurd, calmly. "Consider me a jury, and I'll size up your case when I hear all. Are you innocent of both murders?" "Lady Rachel committed suicide," said Jessop, raising a haggard face. "Yes, I stick to that, sir. As to Krill's death in London, I didn't touch him. I swear I didn't." "But you saw him on that night." "How can you prove that?" "Very simple. Norman, or Krill if you prefer the old name, took certain jewellery to Pash for safe keeping shortly before his death. You presented to Pash a paper undeniably written and signed by the old man, saying that the jewellery was to be given up to the bearer. Now, before taking the jewellery to Pash, Krill could not have written that paper. So you must have seen him during the few hours which elapsed between his visit to Pash and his death." This was clearly argued, and Jessop could not contradict. "I left him quite well and hearty." "In the cellar in Gwynne Street?" "Yes, in the cellar," admitted Jessop. "At what time?" "About 8:30. Say between 8 and 9." "Well, what happened?" asked Hurd, smoking quietly. The sailor twisted his big hands and groaned. Then he laid his head on the table and began to sob, talking brokenly and huskily. "I'm done for," he gasped. "I knowed it would come. No, I ain't sorry. I've had a nightmare of a time. Oh, since I pawned that brooch." "Ah, then you did pawn the brooch at Stowley?" Jessop sat up and wiped his eyes. "Yes, I did, but I pulled my cap down over my eyes and buttoned up my pea jacket. I never thought old Tinker would ha' knowed me." "Wasn't it rather rash of you to pawn the brooch in a place where you were well known?" "I wasn't well known. I only come at times, and then I went away. Old Tinker hadn't seen me more nor once or twice. Then I pulled down my cap." Jessop, badly shaken, was beginning to tell the episode over again, when Hurd stopped him. "See here," said the detective, "you say that you are innocent?" "I swear that I am," gasped Jessop. "Well, then, I'll give you the benefit of the doubt. My business is not to hang innocent people. Take a glass of rum, and tell me all you know, beginning with your first meeting with Krill, and running down through the death of Lady Rachel to your last meeting in the Gwynne Street cellar. And when you know all, then I'll see what is to be done." "Will you arrest me?" "I have arrested you. Don't make conditions with me, man," said Hurd, with a stern face. "The night is growing late, and I want to get to the bottom of this business before we go to bed. Take some rum." Seeing that there was nothing for it but to make a clean breast, Captain Jarvey Jessop wasted no further time in useless lamentation. He could have smashed Hurd easily enough, even though there was the risk of being shot, but the fracas would bring others on the scene, and Jessop knew he could not deal with the police. Therefore he took a stiff peg and became quieter. In fact, when once started on his confession, he appeared to be rather relieved. "It's been a nightmare," said he, wiping his forehead. "I'm glad it's come to the law, that I am. I met Krill, as he was then, some 25 years back, by chance, as you may say." He cast a strange look at the detective, which the latter noted. "Yes, by chance, Mr. Hurd. I found he'd kept the pub here, and this being no distance from Southampton, I took to running down here when the barkie was at anchor. Me and Krill became great mates, and I had what you might call free quarters here. Yes, sir, it's a frozen fact." "Very generous of Mr. Krill," remarked Hurd dryly, and wondering what the man was keeping back. "Oh, he was right enough as a mate when not drunk, but the liquor made him a howling dog." "I've seen many drunk in many places," said Jessop, "but any one who held his liquor worse nor Krill I never did see. He'd knife you as soon as look at you when drunk." "But he evidently preferred strangling." "Hold on, mate," said Jessop, with another deep pull at the rum. "I'm coming to that night. We was both on the bust, as you may say, and Mrs. Krill she didn't like it, so she got to bed with the child." "How old was the child?" "Maud? Oh, you might say she was 13 or 15. I can't be sure of her age. What's up?" For Hurd, seeing in this admission a confirmation that Maud was either not Krill's child or was illegitimate, could not inherit the money, had showed his feelings. However, he made some trivial excuse, not wishing to be too confidential, and begged Jessop to proceed. "Well, mate," said the captain, filling another glass of rum, "you see, the lady had come earlier and had been put to bed by the missus. I never saw her myself, being drinking in this very room along with Krill. But he saw her," added Jessop emphatically, "and said as she had a fine opal brooch, which he wished he'd had, as he wanted money, and the missus kept him tight." "Krill was a judge of jewels?" "Travelled in jewels once," said the captain. "Bless you, he could size up a precious stone in no time. But he sat drinking with me, and every now and then got out of the room, when he'd stop away for perhaps a quarter of an hour at a time." "Did he mention the opal brooch again?" "No," said Jessop, after reflection, "he didn't. But he got so drunk that he began to show fight, as he always did when boozy, though a timid chap when sober. I concluded, wishing no row, to get to my hammock and cut upstairs. Then I went by mistake into the room of that poor lady, carrying a candle, and saw her tied to the bedpost, stone dead, with a silk handkerchief round her neck. I shouted out blue murder, and Mrs. Krill, with the kid, came tumbling down. I was so feared," added Jessop, wiping his forehead at the recollection, "that I ran out of doors." "What good would that do?" "Lord, I don't know," confessed the man, shivering, "but I was scared out of my life. It was raining pitchforks, as you might say, and I raced on through the rain for an hour or so. Then I thought, as I was innocent, I'd make tracks back, and I did. I found Krill had cut." "Did his wife tell you?" "Oh, she was laying on the floor insensible, where he knocked her down. And the kid, Lord," Jessop spat, "she was lying in the corner, with her lips fastened together with the brooch." "What!" cried Hurd, starting to his feet. "The same as Norman's was?" Jessop nodded and drank some rum. "Made me sick, it did. I took the brooch away and slipped it into my pocket. Then the kid said her father had fastened her lips together and had knocked her mother flat when she interfered. I brought Mrs. Krill round, and then left her with the kid, and walked off to Southampton. The police found me there, and I told them what I tell you." "Did you tell about the brooch?" "Well, no, I didn't," confessed Jessop, coolly, "and as the kid and the mother said nothing, I didn't see why I shouldn't keep it, wanting money. So I went to Stowley and pawned it, then took a deep sea voyage for a year. When I come back all was over." "Do you think Krill murdered the woman?" asked Hurd, passing over for the moment the fact that Jessop had stolen the brooch. "He said he didn't," rejoined the man with emphasis, "but I truly believe, mister, as he did. One of them times, when mad with drink and out of the room. He wanted the brooch, d'ye see, though why he should have lost the loot by sealing the kid's mouth with it, I can't say." "When did you come across Krill again?" "Oh," said Jessop, drawing his hand across his mouth, "'twas this way, d'ye see. I come round here lots, and a swell come too. A cold—" "Grexon Hay," said Hurd, pointing to the photograph. "Yes, that's him," said Jessop, staring, "and I hated him, just. With his eye glass and his sneering ways. He loved the kid, now a grown fine gal, as you know, and come here often. In June, at the end of it anyhow, he comes, and I hears him tell Mrs. Krill, who was always looking for her husband, that a one-eyed bookseller in Gwynn Street, Drury Lane, had fainted when he saw the very identical brooch showed him by another cove." "Beecot, I know. Did you wonder how the brooch had left the pawn shop?" asked Hurd, very attentive. "No, I didn't," snarled Jessop, who was growing cross. "I knew old Tinker's assistant had sold the brooch, and he didn't ought to have done it, as I wanted it back. Mrs. Krill asked me about the brooch and wanted it, so I said I'd get it back. Tinker said it was gone, but wrote to the gent as bought it." "Mr. Simon Beecot, of Wargrove in Essex?" "That was him, but the gent wouldn't give it back, so I suppose he'd give it to his son. Well then, when Mrs. Krill heard of the one-eyed man fainting at sight of the brooch, she knew 'twas her husband, as he had one eye, she having knocked the other out when he was sober." "Did she go up and see him?" "Well," said Jessop slowly, "I don't rightly know what she did do, but she went up. I don't think she saw Krill at his shop. but she might have seen that Pash, who is Mr. Hay's lawyer, and a dirty little ape of sorts he is." "Ah," said Hurd to himself, "I thought Pash knew about the women beforehand. No wonder he stuck to them, and gave poor Miss Norman the go by." He rubbed his hands and chuckled. "Well, we'll see what will come of the matter. Go on, Jessop." "There ain't much more to tell," grumbled the captain. "I heard of this, and I wasn't meant to hear, but I thought I'd go up and see if I could get money out of Krill by saying I'd tell about the murder of Lady Rachel." "You are a scoundrel," said Hurd, coolly. "I was hard up," apologized the captain, "or I wouldn't. Not me. I'm straight enough when in cash. So I went up in July." "On the 6th of July?" "If that was the day of the murder, yes. I went up and loafed round until it was dark, and then slipped through that side passage at 8 o'clock to see Krill." "How did you know where to find him?" "Well, that Hay knew about the chap, and said as he did business in the cellar after 8. So Krill let me in, thinking, I suppose, I was a customer. He'd been drinking a little and was bold enough, but when I said, as I'd say, he killed Lady Rachel, he swore he was an innocent babe, and cried, the drink dying out of him." "The same as it died out of you lately," said Hurd, smiling. "Go slow," grunted the captain in a surly tone. "I ain't afraid now, as I ain't done nothing. I said to Krill I'd say nothing if he'd give me money. He wouldn't, but he said he placed a lot of pawned things with Pash, and I could have them. Then he gave me a paper saying I was to have the things, and I went to Pash the next morning and had trouble. But I heard by chance," again Jessop cast a strange look at Hurd, "that Krill had been murdered. So I didn't wait for the lawyer to come back, but cut down to Southampton and went on a short voyage. Then I come here and you nabbed me, and Jessop finished his rum. That's all I know." "Do you swear you left Aaron Norman alive?" "Meaning Krill? I do. He wasn't no use to me dead, and I made him give me the jewels Pash had, do you see?" "But who warned you of the death when you were waiting?" Jessop seemed unwilling to speak, but when pressed, burst out, "'Twas a measly little kid, with ragged clothes and a dirty face." "Tray," said Hurd. I wonder how he knew of the murder before it got into the papers." Chapter 20